1. On the fetish character in music and the regression of listening. Complaints about the decline of musical taste begin only a little later than mankind's twofold discovery, on the threshold of historical time, that music represents at once the immediate manifestation of impulse and the locus of its taming. It stirs up the dance of the maenads and sounds from Pan's bewitching flute, but it also rings out from the Orphic lyre, around which the visions of violence range themselves, pacified. Whenever their peace seems to be disturbed by bacchantic agitation, there is talk of the decline of taste. But if the disciplining function of music has been handed down since Greek philosophy as a major good, then certainly the pressure to be permitted to obey music ally, as elsewhere, is today more general than ever. Just as the current musical consciousness of the masses can scarcely be called Dionysian, so its latest changes have nothing to do with taste. The concept of taste is itself outmoded. Responsible art adjusts itself to criteria which approximate judgments, the harmonious and the inharmonious, the correct and incorrect. But otherwise, no more choices are made, the question is no longer put, and no one demands a subjective justification of the conventions. The very existence of the subject to good. 30. The culture industry verify such taste has become as questionable as has, at the opposite pole, the right to a freedom of choice which empirically, in any case, no one any longer exercises. If one seeks to find out who likes a commercial piece, one cannot avoid the suspicion that liking and disliking are inappropriate to the situation, even if the person shined clothes his reactions in those words. The familiarity of the piece is a surrogate for the quality ascribed to it. To like it is almost the same thing as to recognize it. An approach in terms of value judgments has become a fiction for the person who finds himself hemmed in by standardized musical goods. He can neither escape impotence nor decide between the offerings where everything is so completely identical that preference in fact depends merely on biographical details or on the situation in which things are heard. The categories of autonomously oriented art have no applicability to the contemporary reception of music, not even for that of the serious music, domesticated under the barbarous name of classical so as to enable one to turn away from it again in comfort. If it is objected that specifically light music and everything intended for consumption have in any sense never been experienced in terms of those categories, it must certainly be conceded. Nevertheless, such music is also affected by the change in that the entertainment, the pleasure, the enjoyment it promises, is given only to be simultaneously denied. In one of his essays, Aldous Huxley has raised the question of who, in a place of amusement, is really being amused. With the same justice, it can be asked who music for entertainment still entertains. Rather, it seems to complement the reduction of people to silence, the dying out of speech as expression, the inability to communicate at all. It inhabits the pockets of silence that develop between people molded by anxiety, work and undemanding docility. Everywhere it takes over, unnoticed, the deadly sad role that fell to it in the tin and the specific situation of the silent films. It is perceived purely as background. If nobody can any longer speak, then certainly nobody can any longer listen. An American specialist in radio advertising, who indeed prefers to make use of the musical medium, has expressed skepticism as to the value of this advertising, because people have learned to deny their attention to what they are hearing even while listening to it. His observation is questionable with respect to the, on the fetish character. 3. Advertising value of music, but it tends to be right in terms of the reception of the music itself. In the conventional complaints about declining taste, certain motifs constantly recur. There is no lack of pouting and sentimental comments assessing the current musical condition of the masses as one of degeneration. The most tenacious of these motifs is that of sensuality, which allegedly enfeebles and incapacitates heroic behavior. This complaint can already be found in Book 3 of Plato's Republic, in which he bans the harmonies expressive of sorrow as well as the soft harmonies suitable for drinking, without it being clear to this day why the philosopher ascribes these characteristics to the mixed Lydian, bass Lydian and Ionian modes. In the Platonic state, the major of later Western music, which corresponds to the Ionian, would have been tabooed. The flute and the panharmonic stringed instruments also fall under the ban. The only modes to be left are warlike, to sound the note or accent which a brave man utters in the hour of danger and stern resolve, or when he faces injury, defeat or death, or any other misfortune, with the same steadfast endurance. Plato's Republic is not the utopia it is called by the official history of philosophy. It disciplines its citizens in terms of its existence and will to exist even in music, where the distinction made between soft and strong modes was by Plato's time already little more than a residue of the mastia superstition. The Platonic irony reveals itself mischievously and jeering at the flute player Marsyas, flayed by the sober-sided Apollo. Plato's ethical musical program bears the character of an Attic purge in Spartan style. Other perennial themes of musical sermonizing are on the same level. Among the most prominent of these are the charge of superficiality and that of a cult of personality. What is attacked is chiefly progress, social, essentially the specifically aesthetic, intertwined with the forbidden allurements are sensual gaiety and differentiating consciousness. The predominance of the person over the collective compulsion in music marks the movement of subjective freedom which breaks through in later phases, while the profanation which frees it from its magic circle appears as superficiality. Thus, the lamented moments have entered into the great music of the West. Sensory stimulation is the gate of entry into the harmonic and eventually the coloristic dimensions, the unbridled person as the bearer of expression and 32. The culture industry of the humanization of music itself. Superficiality as a critique of the mute objectivity of forms, in the sense of Haydn's choice of the gallant in preference to the learned. Haydn's choice indeed, and not the recklessness of a singer with a golden throat or an instrumentalist of lip-smacking euphony, for those moments entered into great music and were transformed in it, but great music did not dissolve into them. In the multiplicity of stimulus and expression, its greatness is shown as a force for synthesis. Not only does the musical synthesis preserve the unity of appearance and protect it from falling apart into diffuse culinary moments, but in such unity, in the relation of particular moments to an evolving whole, there is also preserved the image of a social condition in which above those particular moments of happiness would be more than mere appearance. Until the end of prehistory, the musical balance between partial stimulus and totality, between exposition and synthesis, between the surface and the underlying, decaying, remains as unstable as the moments of balance between supply and demand in the capitalist economy. The magic flute, in which the utopia of the Enlightenment and the pleasure of a light opera comic song precisely coincide, is a moment by itself. After the magic flute it was never again possible to force serious and light music together. But what are emancipated from formal law are no longer the productive impulses which rebelled against conventions. Impulse, subjectivity and profanation, the old adversaries of materialistic alienation, now succumb to it. In capitalisms, the traditional anti-mythological ferments of music conspire against freedom, as whose allies they were once proscribed. The representatives of the opposition to the authoritarian schema become witnesses to the authority of commercial success. The delight in the moment and the gay facade becomes an excuse for absolving the listener from the thought of the whole, whose claim is comprised in proper listening. The listener is converted, along his line of least resistance, into the acquiescent purchaser. No longer do the partial moments serve as a critique of that whole. Instead, they suspend the critique which the successful aesthetic totality exerts against the flawed one of society. The unitary synthesis is sacrificed to them. They no longer produce their own in place of the reified one, but show themselves complacent to it. The isolated moments of enjoyment prove incompatible with the immanent constitution of the work of art. On the fetish character. 33. And whatever in the work goes beyond them to an essential perception is sacrificed to them. They are not bad in themselves but in their diversionary function. In the service of success they renounce that insubordinate character which was theirs. They conspire to come to terms with everything which the isolated moment can offer to an isolated individual who long ago ceased to be one. In isolation, the charms become dulled and furnish models of the familiar. Whoever devotes himself to them is as malicious as the Greek thinkers once were toward Oriental sensuality. The seductive power of the charm survives only where the forces of denial are strongest, in the dissonance which rejects belief in the illusion of the existing harmony. The concept of the ascetic is itself dialectical in music. If asceticism once struck down the claims of the aesthetic in a reactionary way, it has today become the sign of an advanced art, not, to be sure, by an archaicizing parsimony of means in which deficiency and poverty are manifested, but by the strict exclusion of all culinary delights which seek to be consumed immediately for their own sake, as if in art the sensory were not the bearer of something intellectual which only shows itself in the whole rather than in isolated topical moments. Art records negatively just that possibility of happiness which the only partially positive anticipation of happiness ruinously confronts today. All light and pleasant art has become illusory and mendacious. What makes its appearance aesthetically in the pleasure categories can no longer give pleasure, and the promise of happiness, once the definition of art, can no longer be found except where the mask has been torn from the countenance of false happiness. Enjoyment still retains a place only in the immediate bodily presence, where it requires an aesthetic appearance. It is illusory by aesthetic standards and likewise cheats the pleasure seeker out of itself. Only where its appearance is lacking is the faith in its possibility maintained. The new phase of the musical consciousness of the masses is defined by displeasure in pleasure. It resembles the reaction to sport or advertising. The words enjoyment of art sound funny, if in nothing else. Schoenberg's music resembles popular songs in refusing to be enjoyed. Whoever still delights in the beautiful passages of a Schubert quartet or even in the provocatively healthy fare of a Handel concerto grosso, ranks as a would-be guardian of culture among the butterfly collectors. 34. The culture industry, what condemns him as an epicure is not perhaps new. The power of the street ballad, the catchy tune and all the swarming forms of the banal has made itself felt since the beginning of the bourgeois era. Formerly, it attacked the cultural privilege of the ruling class. But today, when that power of the banal extends over the entire society, its function has changed. This change of function affects all music, not only light music, in whose realm it could comfortably enough be made innocuous. The diverse spheres of music must be thought of together. Their static separation, which certain caretakers of culture have ardently sought. The totalitarian radio was assigned to the task, on the one hand, of providing good entertainment and diversion, and on the other, of fostering the so-called cultural goods, as if they could still be good entertainment and as if the cultural goods were not, by their administration, transformed into evils. The neat parceling out of music's social field of force is illusionary. Just as the history of serious music since Mozart as a flight from the banal reflects in reverse the outlines of light music, so today, in its key representatives, it gives an account of the ominous experiences which appear even in the unsuspecting innocence of light music. It would be just as easy to go in the other direction and conceal the break between the two spheres, assuming a continuum which permits a progressive education leading safely from commercial jazz and hit songs to cultural commodities. Cynical barbarism is no better than cultural dishonesty. What it accomplishes by disillusion on the higher level, it balances by the ideologies of primitivism and return to nature, with which it glorifies the musical underworld, an underworld which has long ceased to assist the opposition of those excluded from culture to find expression, and now only lives on what is handed down to it from above. The illusion of a social preference for light music as against serious is based on that passivity of the masses which makes the consumption of light music contradict the objective interest of those who consume it. It is claimed that they actually like light music and listen to the higher type only for reasons of social prestige, when acquaintance with the text of a single hit song suffices to reveal the sole function this object of honest approbation can perform. The unity of the two spheres of music is thus that of an unresolved contradiction. They do not hang together. On the fetish character. 35. In such a way that the lower could serve as a sort of popular introduction to the higher, or that higher could renew its lost collective strength by borrowing from the lower. The whole cannot be put together by adding the separated halves, but in both there appear, however distantly, the changes of the whole, which only moves in contradiction. If the flight from the banal becomes definitive, if the marketability of the serious product shrinks to nothing, in consequence of its objective demands, then on the lower level the effects of the standardization of successes means it is no longer possible to succeed in an old style, but only in imitation as such. Between incomprehensibility and inescapability, there is no third way. The situation has polarized itself into extremes which actually meet. There is no room between them for the individual. The latter's claims, wherever they still occur, are illusory, being copied from the standards. The liquidation of the individual is the real signature of the new musical situation. If the two spheres of music are stirred up in the unity of their contradiction, the demarcation line between them varies. The advanced product has renounced consumption. The rest of serious music is delivered over to consumption for the price of its wages. It succumbs to commodity listening. The differences in the reception of official classical music and light music no longer have any real significance. They are only still manipulated for reasons of marketability. The hit song enthusiast must be reassured that his idols are not too elevated for him, just as the visitor to Philharmonic concerts is confirmed in his status. The more industriously the trade erects wire fences between the musical provinces, the greater the suspicion that without these, the inhabitants could all too easily come to an understanding. Toscanini, like a second-rate orchestra leader, is called maestro, if half ironically, and a hit song, Music, Maestro, Please, had its success immediately after Toscanini was promoted to Marshal of the Air with the aid of the radio. The world of that musical life, the composition business which extends peacefully from Irving Berlin and Walter Donaldson, the world's best composer by way of Gershwin, Sibelius and Tchaikovsky to Schubert's B minor symphony, labeled the unfinished, is one of fetishes. The star principle has become totalitarian. The reactions of the listeners appear to have no relation to the playing of the music. They, 36, the culture industry, have reference, rather, to the cumulative success which, for its part, cannot be thought of unalienated by the past spontaneities of listeners, but instead dates back to the command of publishers, Sound Film Mag, Nates and rulers of radio. Famous people are not the only stars. Works begin to take on the same role. A pantheon of bestsellers builds up. The programs shrink, and the shrinking process not only removes the moderately good, but the accepted classics themselves undergo a selection that has nothing to do with quality. In America, Beethoven's Fourth Symphony is among the rarities. This selection reproduces itself in a fatal circle. The most familiar is the most successful and is therefore played again and again and made still more familiar. The choice of the standard works is itself in terms of their effectiveness for program-match fascination. In terms of the categories of success as determined by light music or permitted by the star conductors, the climaxes of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony are placed on the same level as the unspeakable horn melody from the slow movement of Tchaikovsky's Fifth. Melody comes to mean 8-beat symmetrical treble melody. This is catalogued as the composer's idea which one thinks he can put in his pocket and take home, just as it is ascribed to the composer as his basic property. The concept of the idea is far from appropriate to established classical music. Its thematic material, mostly dissected triads, does not at all belong to the author in the same specific sense as in a romantic song. Beethoven's greatness shows itself in the complete subordination of the accidentally private melodic elements to the form as a whole. This does not prevent all music, even Bach, who borrowed one of the most important themes of the well-tempered clavier, from being examined in terms of the category of ideas, with musical larceny being hunted down with all the zeal of the belief in property, so that finally one music commentator could pin his success to the title of tune detective. At its most passionate, musical fetishism takes possession of the public valuation of singing voices. Their sensuous magic is traditional as is the close relation between success and the person endowed with material, but today it is forgotten that it is material. For musical vulgar materialists, it is synonymous to have a voice and to be a singer. In earlier epochs, technical virtuosity, at least, was demanded of singing stars, the castrati and prima donnas. Today, the material as such, on the fetish character, 37, destitute of any function, is celebrated. One need not even ask about capacity for musical performance. Even mechanical control of the instrument is no longer really expected. To legitimate the fame of its owner, a voice need only be especially voluminous or especially high. If one dares even in conversation to question the decisive importance of the voice and to assert that it is just as possible to make beautiful music with a moderately good voice as it is on a moderately good piano, one will immediately find oneself faced with a situation of hostility and aversion whose emotional roots go far deeper than the occasion. Voices are holy properties like a national trademark. As if the voices wanted to revenge themselves for this, they begin to lose the sensuous magic in whose name they are merchandised. Most of them sound like amateur shines of those who have made it, even when they themselves have made it. All this reaches a climax of absurdity in the cult of the master violins. One promptly goes into raptures at the well-announced sound of a Stradivarius or a Marti, which only the ear of a specialist can tell from that of a good modern violin, forgetting in the process to listen to the composition and the execution, from which there is still something to be had. The more modern technique of the violin bow progresses, the more it seems that the old instruments are treasured. If the moments of sensual pleasure in the idea, the voice, the instrument are made into fetishes and torn away from any functions which could give them meaning, they meet a response equally isolated, equally far from the meaning of the whole, and equally determined by success and the blind and irrational emotions which form the relationship to music into which those with no relationship enter. But these are the same relations as exist between the consumers of hit songs and the hit songs. Their only relation is to the completely alien, and the alien, as if cut off from the consciousness of the masses by a dense screen, is what seeks to speak for the silent. Where they react at all, it no longer makes any difference whether it is to Beethoven's Seventh Symphony or to a bikini. The concept of musical fetishism cannot be psychologically derived. That values are consumed and draw feelings to themselves, without their specific qualities being reached by the consciousness of the consumer, is a later expression of their commodity character. For all contemporary musical life is dominated by the commodity form. The 38. The culture industry, last pre-capitalist residues have been eliminated. Music, with all the attributes of the ethereal and sublime which are generously accorded, it serves in America today as an advertisement for commodities which one must acquire in order to be able to hear music. If the advertising function is carefully dimmed in the case of serious music, it always breaks through in the case of light music. The whole jazz business, with its free distribution of scores to bands, has abandoned the idea that actual performance promotes the sale of piano scores and phonograph records. Countless hit song texts praise the hit songs themselves, repeating their titles in capital letters. What makes its appearance, like an idol, out of such masses of type is the exchange value in which the quantum of possible enjoyment has disappeared. Marx defines the fetish character character of the commodity as the veneration of the thing made by oneself which, as exchange value, simultaneously alienates itself from producer to consumer. Human beings. A commodity is therefore a mysterious thing, simply because in it the social character of men's labor appears to them as an objective character stamped upon the product of that labor, because the relation of the producers to the sum total of their own labor is presented to them as a social relation, existing not between themselves, but between the products of their labor. This is the real secret of success. It is the mere reflection of what one pays in the market for the product. The consumer is really worshipping the money that he himself has paid for the ticket to the Toscanini concert. He has literally made the success which he reifies and accepts as an objective criterion, without recognizing himself in it. But he has not made it by liking the concert, but rather by buying the ticket. To be sure, exchange value exerts its power in a special way in the realm of cultural goods, for in the world of commodities this realm appears to be exempted from the power of exchange, to be in an immediate relationship with the goods, and it is this appearance in turn which alone gives cultural goods their exchange value. But they nevertheless simultaneously fall completely into the world of commodities, are produced for the market, and are aimed at the market. The appearance of immediacy is as strong as the compulsion of exchange value is inexorable. The social compact harmonizes the contradiction. The appearance of immediacy takes possession of the mediated, exchange value itself. If the commodity in general combines exchange value and, on the fetish character, 39, use value, then the pure use value, whose illusion the cultural goods must preserve in a completely capitalist society, must be replaced by pure exchange value, which precisely in its capacity as exchange value deceptively takes over the function of use value. The specific fetish character of music lies in this quid pro quo. The feelings which go to the exchange value create the appearance of immediacy at the same time as the absence of a relation to the object belies it. It has its basis in the abstract character of exchange value. Every psychological aspect, every ersatz satisfaction, depends on such social substitution. The change in the function of music involves the basic conditions of the relation between art and society. The more inexorably the principle of exchange value destroys use values for human beings, the more deeply does exchange value disguise itself as the object of enjoyment. It has been asked what the cement is which still holds the world of commodities together. The answer is that this transfer of the use value of consumption goods to their exchange value contributes to a general order in which eventually every pleasure which emancipates itself from exchange values takes on subversive features. The appearance of exchange value in commodities has taken on a specific cohesive function. The woman who has money with which to buy is intoxicated by the act of buying. An American conventional speech. Having a good time means being present at the enjoyment of others, which in its turn has as its only content being present. The auto-religion makes all men brothers in the sacramental moment with the words, that is a Rolls Royce, and in moments of intimacy, women attach greater import, ain't to the hairdressers and cosmeticians than to the situation for the sake of which the hairdressers and cosmeticians are employed. The relation to the irrelevant dutifully manifests its social essence. The couple out driving who spend their time identifying every passing car and being happy if they recognize the trademark speeding by. The girl whose satisfaction consists solely in the fact that she and her boyfriend look good. The expertise of the jazz enthusiast who legitimizes himself by having knowledge about what is in any case inescapable. All this operates according to the same command. Before the theological caprices of commodities, the consumers become temple slaves. Those who sacrifice themselves nowhere else can do so here, and here they are fully betrayed. 40. The culture industry, in the commodity fetishists of the new model, in the sadomasochistic character, in those receptive to today's mass art. The same thing shows itself in many ways. The masochistic mass culture is the necessary manifestation of almighty production itself. When the feeling sees on exchange value, it is no mystical transubstantiation. It corresponds to the behavior of the prisoner who loves his cell because he has been left nothing else to love. The sacrifice of individuality, which accommodates itself to the regularity of the successful, the doing of what everybody does, follows from the basic fact that in broad areas the same thing is offered to everybody by the standardized production of consumption goods. But the commercial necessity of connecting this identity leads to the manipulation of taste and the official culture's pretense of individualism, which necessarily increases in proportion to the liquidation of the individual. Even in the realm of the superstructure, the appearance is not merely the concealment of the essence, but proceeds of necessity from the essence itself. The identical character of the goods which everyone must buy hides itself behind the rigor of the universally compulsory style. The fiction of the relation between supply and demand survives in the fictitiously individual nuances. If the value of taste in the present situation is questioned, it is necessary to understand what taste is composed of in this situation. Acquiescence is rationalized as modesty, opposition to caprice and anarchy. Musical analysis has today decayed as fundamentally as musical charm, and has its parody in the stubborn counting of beats. The picture is completed by accidental differentiation within the strict confines of the prescribed. But if the liquidated individual really makes the complete superficiality of the conventions passionately his own, then the golden age of taste has dawned at the very moment in which taste no longer exists. The works which are the basis of the fetishization and become the cultural goods experience constitutional changes as a result. They become vulgarized. Irrelevant consumption destroys them. Not merely do the few things played again and again wear out, like the Sistine Madonna in the bedroom, but reification affects their internal structure. They are transformed into a conglomeration of eruptions which are impressed on the listeners by climax and repetition, while the organization of the whole makes no impression whatsoever on the fetish character. 4. The memorability of disconnected parts, thanks to climaxes and repetitions, has a precursor in great music itself, in the technique of late romantic compositions, especially those of Wagner. The more reified the music, the more romantic it sounds to alienated ears. Just in this way it becomes property. A Beethoven symphony as a whole, spontaneously experienced, can never be appropriated. The man who in the subway triumphantly whistles loudly the theme of the finale at Brahms' first is already primarily involved with its debris. But since the disintegration of the fetishes puts these themselves in danger and virtually assimilates them to hit songs, it produces a counter tendency in order to preserve their fetish character. If the romanticizing of particular vase eats away the body of the whole. The endangered substance is galvanically copper-plated. The climax, which emphasizes the reified parts, takes on the character of a magical ritual, in which all the mysteries of personality, inwardness, inspiration and spontaneity of reproduction, which have been eliminated from the work itself, are conjured up, just because the disintegrating work renounces the moment of its spontaneity. This, just as stereotyped as the bits and pieces, is injected into it from the outside. In spite of all talk of new objectivity, the essential function of conformist performances is no longer the performance of the pure work but the presentation of the vulgarized one with a gesture which emphatically but impotently tries to hold the vulgarization at a distance. Vulgarization and enchantment, hostile sisters, dwell together in the arrangements which have colonized large areas of music. The practice of arrangement extends to the most diverse dimensions. Sometimes it seizes on the time. It blatantly snatches the reified bits and pieces out of their context and sets them up as a potpourri. It destroys the multi-level unity of the whole work and brings forward only isolated popular passages. The minuet from Mozart's C-flat major symphony, played without the other movement, loses its symphonic cohesion and is turned by the performance into an artisan-type genre piece that has more to do with the Stephanie Gavotte than with the sort of classicism it is supposed to advertise. Then there is the arrangement in coloristic terms. They arrange whatever they can get hold of, as long as the case of a famous interpreter does not forbid it. If in the field of light music the arrangers are 42, the culturi and why, the only trained musicians, they feel called upon to jump around all the more unrestrainedly with cultural goods. All sorts of reasons are offered by them for instrumental arrangements. In the case of great orchestral works, it will reduce the cost. All the composers are accused of lacking technique and instrumentation. These reasons are lamentable pretexts. The argument of cheapness, which aesthetically condemns itself, is disposed of by reference to the superfluity of orchestral means at the disposal of precisely those who most eagerly carry on the practice of arrangement, and by the fact that very often, as in instrumental arrangements of piano pieces, the arrangements turn out substantially dearer than performance in the original form. And finally, the belief that older music needs a coloristic freshening up presupposes an accidental character in the relation between color and line, such as could be assumed only as a result of the crudest ignorance of Vienna classicism and the so eagerly arranged Schubert. Even if the real discovery of the coloristic dimension FRST took place in the era of Berlioz and Wagner, the coloristic parsimony of Haydn or Beethoven is of a piece with the predominance of the principle of construction over the melodic particular, springing in brilliant colors out of the dynamic unity. Precisely in the context of such parsimony do the bassoon thirds at the beginning of the third Leonore overture or the oboe cadenza in the reprise of the first movement of the fifth achieve a power which would be irretrievably lost in a multicolored sonority. One must therefore assume that the motives for the practice of arranging are sui generis. Above all, arranging seeks to make the great distant sound, which always has aspects of the public and unprivate, assimilable. The Tire Busanesium can clap arrange classics on the shoulder and fondle the progeny of their muse. It is a compulsion similar to that which requires radio favorites to insinuate themselves into the families of their listeners as uncles and aunts and pretend to a human proximity. Radical reification produces its own pretense of immediacy and intimacy. Contrariwise, the intimate is inflated and colored by arrangements precisely for being too spare, because they were originally defined only as moments of the whole. The instants of sensory pleasure which emerge out of the decomposing unities are too weak even to produce the sensory stimulus demanded of them in fulfillment of their advertised role. The dressing up and puffing up of, on the fetish character. 43. The individual erases the lineaments of protest, sketched out in the limitation of the individual to himself over and against the institution, just as in the reduction of the large scale to the intimate. Sight is lost of the totality in which bad individual immediacy was kept within bounds in great music. Instead of this, there develops a spurious phalanx which at every step betrays its falsity by its contradiction of the material. Schubert's serenade, in the blown-up sound of the combination of strings and piano, with the silly excessive clarity of the imitative intermediate measures, is as nonsensical as if it has originated in a girls' school. But neither does a prize song from Meister Singer sound any more serious when played by a string orchestra alone. In non-zero chrome, it objectively loses the articulation which makes it viable in Wagner's score, but at the same time, it becomes quite viable for the listener, who no longer has to put the body of the song together from different colors, but can confidently give himself over to the single and uninterrupted treble melody. Here one can put one's hands on the antagonism to the audience into which works regarded as classic fall today. But one may suspect that the darkest secret of arrangement is a compulsion not to leave anything as it is, but to lay hands on anything that crosses one's path. A compulsion that grows greater the less the fundamental characteristics of what exists lend themselves to being meddled with. The total social grasp confirms its power and mastery by the stamp which is impressed on anything that falls into its machinery, but this affirmation is likewise destructive. Contemporary listeners would always prefer to destroy what they hold in blind respect, and their pseudo-activity is already prepared and prescribed by the production. The practice of arrangement comes from salon music. It is the practice of refined entertainment which borrows its pretensions from the niveau of cultural goods, but transforms these into entertainment material of the type of hit songs. Such entertainment, formerly reserved as an accompaniment to people's humming, today spreads over the whole of musical life, which is basically not taken seriously by anyone anymore, and in all discussion of culture retreats further and further into the background. One has a choice of either dutifully going along with the business, if only furtively in front of the loudspeaker on Saturday afternoon, or at once stubbornly and impenitently. 44. The culture industry, acknowledging the trash serve for the ostensible or real needs of the masses. The uncompelling and superficial nature of the objects of refined entertainment inevitably leads to the inattentiveness of the list tenors. One preserves a good conscience in the matter since one is offering the listeners first-class goods. To the objection that these are already a drug on the market, one is ready with the reply that this is what they wanted, an argument which can be finally invalidated by a diagnostic gnosis of the situation of the listeners, but only through insight into the whole process which unites producers and consumers in diabolical harmony. But fetishism takes hold of even the ostensibly serious practice of music, which mobilizes the pathos of distance against refined entertainment. The purity of service to the cause, with which it presents the works, often turns out to be as inimical to them as vulgarization and arrangement. The official ideal of performance, which covers the calf as a result of Toscanini's extraordinary achievement, helps to sanction a condition which, in a phrase of Edward Stuerman, may be called the barbarism of perfection. To be sure, the names of famous works are no longer made fetishes, although the lesser ones that break into the programs almost make the limitation to the smaller repertoire seem desirable. To be sure, passages are not here inflated or climaxes overstressed for the sake of fascination. There is iron discipline, but pre-Sicily iron. The new fetish is the flawlessly functioning, metallically brilliant apparatus as such, in which all the cogwheels mesh so perfectly that not the slightest hole remains open for the meaning of the whole. Perfect, immaculate performance in the latest style preserves the work at the price of its definitive reification. It presents it as already complete from the very first note. The performance sounds like its own phonograph record. The dynamic is so predetermined that there are no longer any tensions at all. The contradictions of the music material are so inexorably resolved at the moment of sound that it never arrives at the synthesis, the self-production of the work, which reveals the meaning of every Beethoven symphony. What is the point of a symphonic effort when the material on which that effort was to be tested has already been ground up? The protective fixation of the works leads to its destruction, for its unity is realized in precisely that spontaneity which is sacrificed to the fixation. This last fetishism, which seizes on the fetish character. 45. The substance itself, smothers it. The absolute adjustment of the appearance to the work denies the latter and makes it disappear unnoticed behind the apparatus. Just a certain swamp. Drainings by labor detachments take place not for their own sake but for that of the work. Not for nothing does the rule of the established conductor remind one of that of the totalitarian Führer. Like the latter, he reduces order and organization to a common denominator. He is the real modern type of the virtuoso, as bandleader as well as in the Philharmonic. He has got to the point where he no longer has to do anything himself. He is even sometimes relieved of reading the score by the staff musical advisors. At one stroke he provides norm and individualization. The norm is identified with his person, and the individual tricks which he perpetrates furnish the general rules. The fetish character of the conductor is the most obvious and the most hidden. The standard works could probably be performed by the virtuosi of contemporary orchestras just as well without the conductor, and the public which cheers a conductor would be unable to tell that, in the concealment of the orchestra, the musical advisor was taking the place of the hero laid low by a cold. The consciousness of the mass listeners is adequate to fetishize music. It listens according to formula, and indeed abasement itself would not be possible if resistance ensued, if the listener still had the capacity to make demands beyond the limits of what was supplied. But if someone tried to verify the fetish character of music by investigating the reactions of listeners with interviews and questionnaires, he might meet with unexpected puzzles. In music as elsewhere, the discrepancy between essence and appearance has grown to a point where no appearance is any longer valid, without mediation, as verification of the essence. The unconscious reactions of the listeners are so heavily veiled and their conscious assessment is so exclusively oriented to the dominant fetish categories that every answer one receives conforms in advance to the surface of that music business, which is attacked by the theory being verified. As soon as one presents the listener with the primitive question about liking or disliking, there comes into play the whole machinery which one had thought could be made transparent and eliminated by the reduction to this question. But if one tries to replace the most elementary investigative procedures with others which take account of the real dependence of the listener on the 46. The culture industry, mechanism. This complication of the investigative procedure not merely makes the interpretation of the result more difficult, but it touches off the resistance of the respondents and drives them all the deeper into the conformist behavior in which they think they can remain concealed from the danger of exposure. No causal nexus at all can properly be worked out between isolated impressions of the hit song and its psychological effects on the listener. If indeed individuals today no longer belong to themselves, then that also means that they can no longer be influenced. The opposing points of production and consumption are at any given time closely coordinated, but not dependent on each other in isolation. Their mediation itself does not in any case escape theoretical conjecture. It suffices to remember how many sorrows he is spared who no longer thinks too many thoughts, how much more in accordance with reality a person behaves when he affirms that the real is right, how much more capacity to use the machinery falls to the person who integrates himself with it uncomplainingly, so that the correspondence between the listener's consciousness and the fetishized music would still remain comprehensible even if the former did not unequivocally reduce itself to the latter. The counterpart of the fetishism of music is a regression of listening. This does not mean a relapse of the individual listener into an earlier phase of his own development, nor a decline in the collective general level, since the millions who are reached musically for the first time by today's mass communications cannot be compared with the audience of the past. Rather, it is contemporary listening which has regressed, arrested at the infantile stage. Not only do the listening subjects lose, along with the freedom of choice and responsibility, the capacity for conscious perception of music, which was from time immemorial confined to a narrow group, but they stubbornly reject the possibility of such perception. They fluctuate between comprehensive forgetting and sudden dives into recognition. They listen atomistically and dissociate what they hear, but precisely in this dissociation they develop certain capacities which accord less with the concepts of traditional aesthetics than with those of football and mentoring. They are not childlike, as might be expected on the basis of an interpretation of the new type of listener in terms of the introduction to musical life of groups previously unacquainted with music, but they are childish, on the fetish character. 47. Their primitivism is not that of the undeveloped, but that of the forcibly retarded. Whenever they have a chance, they display the pinched hatred of those who really sense the other but exclude it in order to live in peace, and who therefore would like best to root out the nagging possibility. The regression is really from this existent possibility, or more concretely, from the possibility of a different and oppositional music. Regressive, 2, is the role which contemporary mass music plays in the psychological household of its victims. They are not merely turned away from more important music, but they are confirmed in their neurotic stupidity, quite irrespective reflective of how their musical capacities are related to the specific musical culture of earlier social phases. The ascent to hit songs and debased cultural goods belongs to the same complex of symptoms as do those phases of which one no longer knows whether the film has alienated them from reality or reality has alienated them from the film, as they wrench open a great formless mouth with shining teeth and a voracious smile, while the tired eyes are wretched and lost above. Together with sport and film, mass music and the new listening help to make escape from the whole infantile milieu impossible. The sickness has a preservative function. Even the listening habits of the contemporary masses are certainly in no way new, and one may readily concede that the reception of the pre-war hit song Popchen was not so very different from that of a synthetic jazz children's song by the context in which such a children's song appears, the masochistic mocking of one's own wish for lost happiness, or the compromising of the desire for happiness itself by the reversion to a childhood whose unattainability bears witness to the unattainability of joy. This is the specific product of the new listening, and nothing which strikes the ear remains exempt from this system of assimilation. There are indeed social differences, but the new listening extends so far that the stultification of the oppressed affects the oppressors themselves, and they become victims of the superior power of self-propelled wheels who think they are determining their direction. Regressive listening is tied to production by the machinery of distribution, and particularly by advertising. Regressive listening appears as soon as advertising turns into terror, as soon as nothing is left for the consciousness but to capitulate before the superior power of the advertised stuff and purchase spiritual peace by making the imposed goods. 48. The cult of reindustrial why, literally its own thing. In regressive listening, advertising takes on a compulsory character. For a while, an English brewery used for propaganda purposes a billboard that bore a deceptive likeness to one of the whitewashed brick walls which are so numerous in the slums of London and the industrial cities of the north. Properly placed, the billboard was barely distinguishable from a real wall. On it, chalk white, was a careful imitation of awkward writing. The word said, "What we want is Watney's." The brand of beer was presented like a political slogan. Not only does this billboard give an insight into the nature of up-to-date propaganda, which sells its slogans as well as its wares, just as here the wares masquerade as a slogan, the type of relationship suggested by the billboard, in which masses make a commodity recommended to them the object of their own action, is in fact found again as the pattern for the reception of light music. They need and demand what has been palmed off on them. They overcome the feeling of impotence that creeps over them in the face of monopolistic production by identifying themselves with the inescapable product. They thereby put an end to the strangeness of the musical brands which are at once distant from them and threateningly near, and in addition, achieve the satisfaction of feeling themselves involved in Mr. Know-Nothing's enterprises, which confront them at every turn. This explains why individual expressions of preference, or, of course, dislike, converge in an area where object and subject alike make such reactions questionable. The fetish character of music produces its own camouflage through the identification of the listener with the fetish. This identification initially gives the hit songs power over their victims. It fulfills itself in the subsequent forgetting and remembering. Just as every advertisement is composed of the inconspicuous familiar and the unfamiliar conspicuous, so the hit song remains salutarily forgotten in the half-dusk of its familiarity, suddenly to become painfully overclear through recollection. As if in the beam of a spotlight, one can almost equate the moment of this recollection with that in which the title or the words of the initial verse of his hit song confront the victim. Perhaps he identifies himself with this because he identifies it and thereby merges with his possession. This compulsion may well drive him to recall the title of the hit song at times, but the writing on the fetish character. 49. Note, which makes the identification possible, is nothing else but the trademark of the hit song. Deconcentration is the perceptual activity which prepares the way for the forgetting and sudden recognition of mass music. If the standardized products, hopelessly like one another except for conspicuous bits such as headlines, do not permit concentrated listening without becoming unbearable to the listeners, the latter are in any case no longer capable of concentrated listening. They cannot stand the strain of concentrated listening and surrender themselves resignedly to what befalls them, with which they can come to terms only if they do not listen to it too closely. Benjamin's reference to the apperception of the cinema in a condition of distraction is just as valid for light music. The usual commercial jazz can only carry out its function because it is not attended to except during conversation and, above all, as an accompaniment to dancing. Again and again one encounters the judgment that it is fine for dancing but dreadful for listening. But if the film as a whole seems to be apprehended in a distracted manner, deconcentrated listening makes the perception of a whole impossible. All that is realized is what the spotlight falls on, striking melodic intervals, unsettling modulations, intentional or unintentional mistakes, or whatever condenses itself into a formula by an especially intimate merging of melody and text. Here, too, listeners and products fit together. They are not even offered the structure which they cannot follow. If atomized listening means progressive decomposition for the higher music, there is nothing more to decompose in the lower music. The forms of hit songs are so strictly standardized, down to the number of beats and the exact duration, that no specific form appears in any particular piece. The emancipation of the parts from their cohesion, and from all moments which extend beyond their immediate present, introduces the diversion of musical interest to the particular sensory pleasure. Typically, the listeners show a preference not merely for particular showpieces for instrumental acrobatics, but for the individual instrumental colors as such. This preference is promoted by the practice of American popular music whereby each variation, or chorus, is played with emphasis on a special instrumental color, with the clarinet, the piano, or the trumpet as quasi-soloist. This often goes so far that the listener seems to care more about treatment and style than about 50. The cult of reindustrial why, the otherwise indifferent material, but with the treatment validating itself only in particular enticing effects. Along with the attraction to color as such, there is of course the veneration for the tool and the drive to imitate and join in the game. Possibly also something of the great delight of children in bright colors, which returns under the pressure of contemporary musical experience. The diversion of interest from the whole, perhaps indeed from the melody, to the charm of color and to the individual trick, could be optimistically interpreted as a new rupture of the disciplining function. But this interpretation would be erroneous. Once the perceived charms remain unopposed in a rigid format, whoever yields to them will eventually rebel against against it, but then they are themselves of the not limited kind. They all center on an impressionistically softened tonality. It cannot be said that interest in the isolated color or the isolated sonority awakens a taste for new colors and new sonorities. Rather, the atomistic listeners are the first to denounce such sonorities as intellectual or absolutely dissonant. The charms which they enjoy must be of an approved type. To be sure, dissonances occur in jazz practice, and even techniques of intentional misplaying have developed, but an appearance of harmlessness accompanies all these customs. Every extravagant sonority must be so produced that the listener can recognize it as a substitute for a normal one. While he rejoices in the mistreatment the dissonance gives to the consonance whose place it takes, the virtual consonance simultaneously guarantees that one remains within the circle. In tests on the reception of hit songs, people have been found to ask how they should act if a passage simultaneously pleases and displeases them. One may well suspect that they report an experience which also occurs to those who give no account of it. The reactions to isolated charms are ambivalent. A sensory pleasure turns into disgust as soon as it is seen how it only still serves to betray the consumer. The betrayal here consists in always offering the same thing. Even the most insensitive hit song enthusiast cannot always escape the feeling that the child with a sweet tooth comes to know in the candy store. If the charms wear off and turn into their opposite, the short life of most hit songs belongs in the same range of experience. Then the cultural ideology which clothes the upper level musical business finishes things off by causing the lower to be heard. On the fetish character. 5. With a bad conscience. Nobody believes so completely in prescribed pleasure, but the listening nevertheless remains regressive in assenting to this situation despite all distrust and all ambivalence. As a result of the displacement of feelings into exchange value, no demands are really advanced in music anymore. Substitutes satisfy their purpose as well, because the demand to which they adjust themselves has itself already been substituted. But ears which are still only able to hear what one demands of them and what is offered, and which register the abstract charm instead of synthesizing the nonsense of charm, are bad ears. Even in the isolated phenomenon, key aspects will escape them. That is, those which transcend its own isolation. There is actually a neurotic mechanism of stupidity in listening. 2. The arrogantly ignorant rejection of everything unfamiliar is its sure sign. Regressive listeners behave like children. Again and with stubborn malice, they demand the one dish they have once been served. A sort of musical children's language is prepared for them. It differs from the real thing in that its vocabulary consists exclusively of fragments and distortions of the artistic language of music. In the piano scores of hit songs, there are strange diagrams. They relate to guitar, ukulele and banjo, as well as the accordion. Infantile instruments in comparison with the piano and are intended for players who cannot read the notes. They depict graphically the fingering for the chords of the plucking instruments. The rationally comprehensible notes are replaced by visual directives, to some extent by musical traffic signals. These signs, of course, confine themselves to the three tonic major chords and exclude any meaningful harmonic progression. The regulated musical traffic is worthy of them. It cannot be compared with that in the streets. It swarms with mistakes in phrasing and harmony. There are wrong pitches, incorrect doublings of thirds, fifths and octave progressions, and all sorts of illogical treatments of voices, sometimes in the bass. One would like to blame them on the amateurs with whom most of the hit songs originate, while the real musical work is first done by the arrangers. But just as a publisher does not let a misspelled word go out into the world, so it is inconceivable that, well advised by their experts, they publish amateur versions without checking them. The mistakes are either consciously produced by the experts or intentionally permitted to stand, for the sake of the listeners. 1. 52. The culture industry could attribute to the publishers and experts the wish to ingratiate themselves with the listeners, composing as nonchalantly and informally as a dilettante drums out a hit song after hearing it. Such intrigues would be of the same stripe, even if considered psychologically different, as the incorrect spelling in many advertising slogans. But even if one wanted to exclude their acceptance as too far-fetched, the typographical errors could be understood. On the one hand, the infantile hearing demands sensually rich and full sonority, sometimes represented by the luxuriant thirds, and it is precisely this demand in which the infantile musical language is in most brutal contradiction with the children's song. On the other hand, the infantile hearing always demands the most comfortable and fluent resolutions. The consequences of the richer sonority, with correct treatment of voices, would be so far from the standardized harmonic relations that the listener would have to reject them as unnatural. The mistakes would then be the bold strokes which reconcile the antagonisms of the infantile listener's consciousness. No less characteristic of the regressive musical language is the quotation. Its use ranges from the conscious quotation of folk and children's songs, by way of ambiguous and half-accidental allusions, to completely latent similarities and associations. The tendency triumphs in the adaptation of whole pieces from the classical stock or the operatic repertoire. The practice of quotation mirrors the ambivalence of the infantile listener's consciousness. The quotations are at once authoritarian and a parody. It is thus that a child imitates the teacher. The ambivalence of the retarded listeners has its most extreme expression in the fact that individuals, not yet fully reified, want to extricate themselves from the mechanism of music reification to which they have been handed over, but that their revolts against fetishism only entangle them more deeply in it. Whenever they attempt to break away from the passive status of compulsory consumers and activate themselves, they succumb to pseudo-activity. Types rise up from the masses of the retarded who differentiate themselves by pseudo-activity and nevertheless make the regression more strikingly visible. There are, first, the enthusiasts who write fan letters to radio stations and orchestras and, at well-managed jazz festivals, produce their own enthusiasm as an advertisement for the wares they consume. They call themselves, on the fetish character. 53. Jitterbugs, as if they simultaneously wanted to affirm and mock their loss of individuality, their transformation into beetles whirring around in fascination. Their only excuse is that the term jitterbugs, like all those in the unreal edifice of films and jazz, is hammered into them by the entrepreneurs to make them think that they are on the inside. Their ecstasy is without content. That it happens that the music is listened to. This replaces the content itself. The ecstasy takes possession of its object by its often compulsive character. It is stylized like the ecstasy savages go into in beating the war drums. It has convulsive aspects reminiscent of Saint Vitus's dance or the reflexes of mutilated animals. Passion itself seems to be produced by defects, but the ecstatic ritual betrays itself as pseudo-activity by the moment of mimicry. People do not dance or listen from sensuality, and sensuality is certainly not satisfied by listening, but the gestures of the sensual are imitated. An analog is the representation of particular emotions in the FLM, where there are physiognomic patterns for anxiety, longing, the erotic look, for smiling, for the atomistic expressivo of debased music. The imitative assimilation to commodity models is intertwined with folkloristic customs of imitation. In jazz, the relation of such mimicry to the imitating individual himself is quite loose. Its medium is caricature. Dance and music copy stages of sexual excitement only to make fun of them. It is as if desire's surrogate itself simultaneously turned against it. The realistic behavior of the oppressed triumphs over his dream of happiness while being itself incorporated into the latter, and as if to confirm the superficiality and treachery of every form of ecstasy, the feet are unable to fall for what the ear pretends. The same jitterbugs who behave as if they were electrified by syncopation dance almost exclusively the good rhythmic parts. The weak flesh punishes the lies of the willing spirit. The gestural ecstasy of the infantile listener misfires in the face of the ecstatic gesture. The opposite type appears to be the eager person who leaves the factory and occupies himself with the music in the quiet of his bedroom. He is shy and inhibited, perhaps has no luck with girls, and wants in any case to preserve his own special sphere. He seeks this as a radio ham. At 20, he is still at the stage of a Boy Scout working on complicated knots just to please his parents. This type is held in high esteem in radio matters. He patiently builds sets whose most important parts he must buy ready-made, and scans the air for shortwave secrets. 54. The culture industry. Why, though there are none. As a reader of Indian stories and travel books, he once discovered unknown lands and cleared his path through the forest. Primeval. As radio ham he becomes the discoverer of just those industrial products which are interested in being discovered by him. He brings nothing home which would not be delivered to his house. The adventurers of pseudo-activity have already organized themselves on a large scale. The radio amateurs have printed verification cards sent them by the shortwave stations they have discovered, and hold contests in which the winner is the one who can produce the most such cards. All this is carefully fostered from above. Of all fetishistic listeners, the radio ham is perhaps the most complete. It is irrelevant to him what he hears or even how he hears. He is only interested in the fact that he hears and succeeds in inserting himself, with his private equipment, into the public naturalism, without exerting even the slightest influence on it. With the same attitude, countless radio listeners play with the feedback or the sound dial without themselves becoming hams. Others are more expert, or at least more aggressive. These smart chaps can be found everywhere and are able to do everything themselves. The advanced student who in every gathering is ready to play jazz with machine-like precision for dancing and entertainment. The gas station attendant who hums his syncopation ingeniously while filling up the tank. The listening expert who can identify every band and immerses himself in the history of jazz as if it were Holy Writ. He is nearest to the sportsman, if not to the football player himself, then to the swaggering fellow who dominates the stands. He shines by a capacity for rough improvisations, even if he must practice the piano for hours in secret in order to bring the refractory rhythms together. He pictures himself as the individualist who whistles at the world, but what he whistles is its melody, and his tricks are less inventions of the moment than stored up experiences from acquaintance with sought-after technical things. His improviser shines are always gestures of nimble subordination to what the instrument demands of him. The chauffeur is the model for the listening type of the clever fellow. His agreement with everything dominant goes so far that he no longer produces any resistance, but of his own accord always does what is asked of him for the sake of the responsible functionary. He lies to himself about the completeness of his subordination to the rule of the reified mechanism. Thus, the sovereign routine of on the fetish character. 55. Jazz amateur is nothing but the passive capacity for adaptation to models from which to avoid straying. He is the real jazz subject. His improvisations come from the pattern, and he navigates the pattern, cigarette in mouth, as nonchalantly as if he had invented it himself. Regressive listeners have key points in common with the man who must kill time because he has nothing else on which to vent his aggers, sign, and with the casual laborer. To make oneself a jazz expert or hang over the radio all day, one must have much free time and little freedom. The dexterity which comes to terms with the syncopation as well as with the basic rhythm is that of the auto mechanic who can also repair the loudspeaker and the electric light. The new listeners resemble the mechanics who are simultaneously specialized and able of applying their special skills to unexpected places outside their skilled trades. But this despecialization only seems to help them out of the system. The more easily they meet the demands of the day, the more rigidly they are subordinated to that system. The research finding that among radio listeners the friends of light music reveal themselves to be depoliticized is not accidental. The possibility of individual shelter and over security, which is, as always, questionable, obstructs the view of a change in the situation in which one seeks shelter. Superficial experience contradicts this. The younger generation, the concept itself is merely an ideological catch-all, seems to be in conflicts with its elders and their plush culture precisely through the new way of listening. In America, it is just the so-called liberals and progressives whom one finds among the advocates of light popular music, most of whom want to classify their activity as democratic. But if regressive hearing is progressive as opposed to the individualistic sort, it is only in the dialectical sense that it is better fitted to the advancing brutality than the latter. All possible mold has been rubbed off the baseness, and it is legitimate to criticize the aesthetic residue of an individuality that was long since wrested from individuals. But this criticism comes with little force from the sphere of popular music, since it is just this sphere that mummifies the vulgarized and decaying remnants of romantic individualism. Its innovations are inseparably coupled with these remnants. Masochism in hearing is not only defined by self-surrender and pseudo-pleasure through identification with power. Underlying it is 56. The culture industry, the knowledge that the security of shelter under the ruling conditions is a provisional one, that it is only a respite, and that eventually everything must collapse. Even in self-surrender one is not good in his own eyes. In his enjoyment one feels that he is simultaneously betraying the possible and being betrayed by the existent. Regressive listening is always ready to degenerate into rage. If one knows that he is basically marking time, the rage is directed primarily against everything which could disavow the modernity of being with it and up to date and reveal how little has in fact changed. From photographs and movies, one knows the effects produced by either modern grown old, an effect originally used by the surrealists to shock and subsequently degraded to the cheap amusement of those whose fetishism fastens on the abstract present. For the regressive listener, this effect is fantastically foreshortened. They would like to ridicule and destroy what yesterday they were intoxicated with, as if in retrospect to revenge themselves for the fact that the ecstasy was not actually such. This effect has been given name of its own and repeatedly been propagated in press and radio. But we should not think of the rhythmically simpler, light music of the pre-jazz era and its relics as corny. Rather, the term applies to all those syncopated pieces which do not conform to the approved rhythmic formula of the present moment. A jazz expert can shake with laughter when he hears a piece which in good rhythm follows a 16th note with a punctuated 8. Although this rhythm is more aggressive and in no way more provincial in character than the syncopated connection and renunciation of all counter-stress practice later, the regressive listeners are in fact destructive. The old-timer's insult has its ironic justification. Ironic, because the destructive tendencies of the regressive listeners are in truth directed against the same thing that the old-fashioned hate, against disobedience as such, unless it comes under the tolerated spontaneity of collective excesses. The seeming opposition of the generations is nowhere more transparent than in rage. The bigots who complain to the radio stations in pathetic sadistic letters of the jazzing up of holy things and the youth who delights in such exhibitions are of one mind. It requires only the proper situation to bring them together in a united front. This furnishes a criticism of the new possibilities in regressive listening. One might be tempted to rescue it if it was something on the fetish character. 57, which the auratic characteristics of the work of art, its illusory elements, gave way to the playful ones. However it may be with films, today's mass music shows little of such progress and disenchantment. Nothing survives in it more steadfastly than the illusion. Nothing is more illusory than its reality. The infantile play has scarcely more than the name in common with the productivity of children. Otherwise, bourgeois sport would not want to differentiate itself so strictly from play. Its bestial seriousness consists in the fact that instead of remaining faithful to the dream of freedom by getting away from purposiveness, the treatment of play as a duty puts it among useful purposes and thereby wipes out the trace of freedom in it. This is particularly valid for contemporary mass music. It is only play as a repetition of prescribed models, and the playful release from responsibility which is thereby achieved does not reduce at all the time devoted to duty except by transferring the responsibility to the models, the following of which one makes into a duty for himself. In this lies the inherent pretense of the dominant music sport. It is illusory to promote the technical rational moments of contemporary mass music, or the special capacities of the regressive listeners which may correspond to these moments, at the expense of a decayed magic, which nevertheless prescribes the rules for the bare functioning itself. It would also be illusory because the technical innovations of mass music really don't exist. This goes without saying for harmonic and melodic construction. The real coloristic accomplishment of modern dance music, the approach of the different colors to one another to the extent that one instrument replaces another without a break or one instrument can disguise itself as another, is as familiar to Wagnerian and post-Wagnerian orchestral technique as the mute effects of the brasses. Even in the techniques of syncopation, there is nothing that was not present in rudimentary form in Brahms and outdone by Schoenberg and Stravinsky. The practice of contemporary popular music has not so much developed these techniques as conformistically dulled them. The listeners who expertly view these techniques with astonishment are in no way technically educated thereby, but react with resistance and rejection as soon as the techniques are introduced to them in those contexts in which they have their meaning. Whether a technique can be considered progressive and rational depends on this meaning and 58. The culture industry, on its place in the whole of society as well as in the organization of the particular work. Technical development as such can serve crude reactions as soon as it has established itself as a fetish and by its perfection represents the neglected social tasks as already accomplished. This is why all attempts to reform mass music and regressive listening on the basis of what exists are frustrated. Consumable art music must pay by the sacrifice of its consistency. Its faults are not artistic. Every incorrectly composed or outmoded chord bespeaks the backwardness of those to whose demand accommodation is made. But technically consistent, harmonious mass music purified of all the elements of bad pretense would turn into art music and at once lose its mass basis. Idle attempts at reconciliation, whether by market-oriented artists or collectively oriented art educators, are fruitless. They have accomplished nothing more than handicrafts or the sort of products with which directions for use or a social text must be given, so that one may be properly informed about the deeper background, the positive aspect for which the new mass music and regressive listening are praised, vitality and technical progress, collective breadth and relation to an undefined practice, into whose concepts there has entered the supplicant self, denunciation of the intellectuals, who can thereby finally end their social alienation from the masses in order to coordinate themselves politically with contemporary mass consciousness. This positive is a negative, the eruption into music of a catastrophic phase of society. The positive lies locked up solely in its negativity. Fetishized mass music threatens the fetishized cultural goods. The tension between the two spheres of music has so grown that it becomes difficult for the official sphere to hold its ground. However little it has to do with technical standards of mass music. If one compares the special knowledge of a jazz expert with that of a Toscanini worshipper, the former is far ahead of the latter. But regressive listening represents a growing and merciless enemy not only to museum cultural goods but to the age-old sacral function of music as the locus for the taming of impulses. Not without penalty, and therefore not without restraint, are the debased products of musical culture surrender to disrespectful play and sadistic humor. In the face of regressive listening, music as a whole begins to take on a comic aspect. One need only listen to the uninhibited sonority of on the fetish character. 59. Choral rehearsal from outside. outside. This experience was caught with great force in a film by the Marx Brothers, who demolish an opera set as if to clothe in allegory the insight of the philosophy of history on the decay of the operatic form, or in a most estimable piece of refined entertainment, break up a grand piano in order to take possession of its strings and their frame as the true harp of the future, on which to play a prelude. Music has become comic in the present phase primarily because something so completely useless is carried on with all the visible signs of the strain of serious work. By being alien to solid people, music reveals their alienation from one another, and the consciousness of alienation vents itself in laughter. In music, or similarly in lyric poetry, the society which judged them comic becomes comic. But involved in this laughter is the decay of the sacral spirit of reconciliation. All music today can very easily sound as parcel did to Nietzsche's ear. It recalls incomprehensible rites and surviving masks from an earlier time, and is provocative nonsense. The radio, which both wears out music and overexposes it, makes a major contribution to this. Perhaps a better hour may at some time strike even for the clever fellows, one in which they may demand, instead of prepared material ready to be switched on, the improvisatory displacement of things, as the sort of radical beginning that can only thrive under the protection of the unshaken real world. Even discipline can take over the expression of free solidarity if freedom becomes its content. As little as regressive listening is a symptom of progress and consciousness of freedom, it could suddenly turn around if art, in unity with the society, should ever leave the road of the always identical. Not popular music but artistic music has furnished a model for this possibility. It is not for nothing that Mahler is the scandal of all Borgia's musical aesthetics. They call him uncreative because he suspends their concept of creation itself. Everything with which he occupies himself is already there. He accepts it in its vulgarized form. His themes are expropriated ones. Nevertheless, nothing sounds as it was wont to. All things are diverted as if by a magnet. What is worn out yields kindly to the improvising hand. The used parts win a second life as variants. Just as the chauffeur's knowledge of his old second-hand car can enable him to drive it punctually and unrecognized to its intended destination, so can the expression of a beat-up melody, straining under 60. The culture industry why the pressure of clarinets and oboes in the upper register arrive at places which the approved musical language could never safely reach. Such music readily crystallizes the whole, into which it has incorporated the vulgarized fragments, into something new, yet it takes its material from regressive listening indeed. One can almost think that in Mahler's music this experience was seismographically recorded 40 years before it permeated society. But if Mahler stood athwart the concept of musical progress, neither can the new and radical music whose most advanced practitioners give allegiance to him in a seemingly paradoxical way any longer be subsumed exclusively under the concept of progress. It proposes to consciously resist the phenomenon of regressive listening. The terror which Schoenberg and Webern spread, today as in the past, comes not from their incomprehensibility but from the fact that they are all too correctly understood. Their music gives form to that anxiety, that terror, that insight into the catastrophic situation which others merely evade by regressing. They are called individualists, and yet their work is nothing but a single dialogue with the powers which destroy individuality, powers whose formless shadows fall gigantically on their music. In music, too, collective powers are liquidating an individuality past saving, but against them only individuals are capable of consciously representing the aims of collectivity. 2. The schema of mass culture. The commercial character of culture causes the difference between culture and practical life to disappear. Aesthetic semblance, shine, turns into the sheen which commercial advertising lends to the commodities which absorb it in turn. But that moment of independence which philosophy specifically grasped under the idea of aesthetic semblance is lost in the process. On all sides the borderline between culture and empirical reality becomes more and more indistinct. Thorough efforts in this direction have long been underway. Since the beginning of the industrial era, an art has been in vogue which is adept at promoting the right attitudes and which has entered into alliance with reification insofar as it proffers precisely for a disenchanted world. For the realm of the prosaic and even the benosic, a poetry of its own nourished upon the work ethic. Goebbels then prescribed it in the form of an iron romanticism for totalitarian purposes. It was not without good reason that writings like Hinterplug and Scrobstock behind Plough and Vice, and even Soul and Haben, Debit and Credit, which were recommended to the young as particularly suitable fare, enjoyed such popularity in Germany. Such works are cited around the fundamental fracture within bourgeois education. Officially, 62. The culture industry. This education is oriented towards the realm of the ideal, towards Alice Schurner and Goethe, everything that is beautiful and good. It encourages admiration for the heroic individual and glorifies the values of candor, unselfishness and generosity. And yet from our earliest youth all of this is only admitted on the condition that it is not after all to be taken seriously. With every gesture the pupil is given to understand that what is most important is understanding the demands of real life and fitting oneself properly for the competitive realm, and that the ideals themselves were either to be taken as a confirmation of this life or were to be immediately placed in its service. Enthusiasm for Schiller meant sowing one's wild oats in good time, and an enthusiastic essay on the Maid of Orleans was a sure promise of time-saving promotion into the higher class at Easter. Herein lies the tacit understanding between teacher and pupil which binds them so firmly together in spite of all other conflicts. The so-called teachers' witticisms and the fraternal gatherings of teachers and students at drinking parties and the like may deceptively conceal the misery of hierarchical subordination, but they simultaneously reveal that identity on the basis of which the hierarchy is built. Nevertheless, the very inexperience of the young, which is so tirelessly impressed upon us, can always mislead them into taking the ideals with which they have been pragmatically presented seriously. One can never be quite sure that the proper integration has been accomplished as early and as radically as it should have been. This is where the likes of Ethan Freytag so promptly and helpfully step in. Beneath the mantle of adventure they smuggle in the contraband of utility, and the reader is persuaded that he does not have to renounce any of his dreams if he eventually becomes an engineer or a shop assistant. Those dreams which in a class society are already enthralled to the world of things and directed towards the imago of the train driver and the pastry cook even before the reliable children's literature has been unleashed upon him. Perhaps the fantastical figure of Robinson Crusoe was already no different, who represented the very model of Homo economicus, being transported by a fortunate shipwreck out of the system of bourgeois society only to reproduce it again through his own effort. As the children's literature likes likes to put it, everything, including war, has its own poetry, if only East lyrics and the products of the work of poets. Starting with Das Flaggenlied, the schema of mass culture. 63. The banner song. Such poetry points the way, mens sono in corpore sano, towards colonial expansion and workers' associations. Today total mass culture has replaced the Neue Universum, New World. The most stylish photographs of aeroplanes soaring above the clouds, the brilliant play of light on moving machinery, the furrowed brows of well-chosen representatives of the common folk emulate that perfidious innocence of the golden book of technology that lies resplendent among the Christmas gifts of the modern liberal child. In the cinema, this misalliance between photography and the novel, such pseudo-poetry becomes complete. It is now so present in every detail that it no longer even needs to express itself as such. It is solely the power which stands behind this everyday poetry today and impresses us with its color-fast and lavish presentation that can still deceive adult human beings about the extended childhood that is only prepared for them so that they might function in all the more adult of fashion. A poetic tremor is expected of every example of emphatic objectivity. The O of astonishment which the objective close-up still stifled is blurted out by the lyrical musical accompaniment. The tremor lives off the excess power which technology as a whole, along with the capital that stands behind it, exercises over every individual thing. This is what transcendence is in mass culture. The poetic mystery of the product, in which it is more than itself, consists in the fact that it participates in the infinite nature of production and the reverential awe inspired by objectivity fit in smoothly with the schema of advertising. It is precisely the stress upon the mere fact of being which is supposed to be so great and strong that no subjective intention can alter it in any way, and this stress corresponds to the true impotence of art in relation to society today, that conceals the transfiguration against which all sober objectivity gestures. Reality becomes its own ideology through the spell cast by its faithful duplication. This is how the technological veil and the myth of the positive is woven. If the real becomes an image insofar as in its particularity it becomes as equivalent to the whole as one Ford car is to all the others of the same range, then the image on the other hand turns into immediate reality. We no longer even approach the much vaunted aesthetic image consciousness. Any achievement of imagination, any expectation that imagination might of its own accord gather together the discrete elements of the real into its truth, is repudiated as 64. The culture industry, an improper presumption. Imagination is replaced by a mechanically, relentless control mechanism which determines whether the latest imago to be distributed really represents an exact, accurate and reliable reflection of the relevant item of reality. The only remnant of aesthetic semblance here is the empty abstract semblance of a difference between culture as such and practice as such, the division of labor as it were between different departments of production. The actual power of aesthetic image consciousness with respect to the reception of works offered has always been highly questionable. It was bound up with educational privilege and conditions of leisure and in its pure form belonged more to the philosophical concept of art than it did to the social fate of works of art and the social conditions of their production. The prevalent concern with the material stratum of works of art, a persistent symptom of the failure of bourgeois civilization, also betrays something of the untruth of aesthetic autonomy itself. Its universality remains a light ideology as long as real hunger is perpetuated in hunger for the material in the aesthetic domain. But if works of art have only intermittently been perceived as such, then mass art has taken that alienation of the masses from art, blindly sustained in life by society, up into the process of production as its presupposition, lives from it and deliberately reproduces it. The work of art becomes its own material and forms the technique of reproduction and presentation, actually a technique for the distribution of a real object. Radio broadcasts for children which intentionally play off image and reality against one another for the sake of advertising commodities and in the next moment have a Wild West hero proclaiming the virtues of some breakfast cereal, betraying the domination of image over the program in the process, are as characteristic as the identification of film stars with their roles which is promoted by the advertising media. The lovers of burning sarong matched again etc. The affair of Orson Welles' broadcast Invasion from Mars was a test performed by the positivistic spirit to determine its own zone of influence and one which showed that the elimination of the distinction between image and reality has already advanced to the point of a collective sickness, that the reduction of the work of art to empirical reason is already capable of turning into overt lunacy at any moment, a lunacy which the fans who send trousers to the Lone Ranger and saddles to his horse already half effect. The schema of mass culture. 65. Successful fusion of waking life and dream life however can allow itself a certain tolerance with regard to ideals. They are accepted as an ahistorical given along with others and the honor which they owe to their opposition to life becomes a means of vindicating them as legitimate and successful elements of real life. A great poet is almost as good as a great inventor or talent scout, just as long as the standing of the work protects us from having to read any of it. With the liquidation of its opposition to empirical reality, art assumes a parasitic character, inasmuch as it now appears itself as reality, which is supposed to stand in for the reality out there. It tends to relate back to culture as its own object. The monopolistic hold on culture, which forbids anything that cannot be grasped, necessarily refers us back to what has already been produced in the past and institutes self-reflection. This is the source of that glaring and yet ineliminable contradiction between the presentation, elegant technical finish and modish procedures on the one hand, and the old-fashioned traditionally individual and culturally derived decayed contents on the other. The contradiction that is revealed in the standardization of what is individual. The bourgeois works of art which mass culture withdraws from circulation on account of their defective fidelity to the real did not take pleasure in themselves precisely because of their strict formal immanence. Kant's doctrine of the sublime is the most striking expression of this. The mass culture which is so true to the facts absorbs the truth content and expends itself in the material, but all it has left as material is itself. Hence all those musicals and biopics and all the biographies about artists etc. Self-reflection is provoked by the techniques of the sound film which can only introduce song into the action in a realistic manner by turning singers into the heroes who first lose and subsequently regain their voices. But the true source of self-reflection lies in the fact that decisive aspects of reality today elude representation through the aesthetic image. Monopoly scorns art, the sensuous individuation of the work, to which mass culture must continue to lay claim precisely if it is to be able to perform its complementary function profitably in a standardized society, contradicts the abstractness and self-sameness to which the world has shrunk. Insofar as a film only recounts the fate of an individual, even if maintaining the most extreme critical awareness, it already succumbs to ideology. The 66. The culture industry, case which is presented as one which is still worth recounting, becomes for all its desperate nature an excuse for the world which has produced something so worthy of being related, while the real desperation expresses itself mutely in the fact there is nothing more to be recounted and that all we can do is recognize it for what it is. Perhaps the gesture of the narrator has always had something apologetic about it, but today it has become nothing but apology through and through. Even a radical film director who wished to portray crucially important social developments like the merger of two industrial concerns could only do so by showing us the dominant figures in the office, at the conference table or in their mansions. Even if they were thereby revealed as monstrous characters, their monstrousness would still be sanctioned as a quality of individual human beings in a way that would tend to obscure the monstrousness of the system whose servile functionaries they are. Yet if the director were to proceed in the most modern fashion and interrupt the life story of the characters with montage technique in which the ominous balance sheets of the steel concern are intercut with images of the might and greatness of the plant itself, and both those intercut with images of the general director himself, this would not only be unintelligible and tedious for the audience but would also automatically transform itself into an artistic ornament on account of its arbitrary psychology. Finally, the magnate would come to acquire a negative symbolic function for those viewers with the least sociological awareness. Anxious concern over the deplorable state of affairs agitates for reform and a society that is generous enough to anticipate its own critique. The ghost town of yesterday implies the full employment of tomorrow. No ideology even needs to be injected. Ever since the pre-shore from above has ceased to tolerate any longer the tension between the individual and the universal, then what is individual can no longer express the universal, and art becomes a form of justification, or at least a means of eliminating the period of fruitless expectation. This is not to say that art should seek its true vocation solely in the representation of the relations of production, for precisely this is in all probability impossible for it. But mass culture expressly claims to be close to reality only to betray this claim immediately by redirecting it to conflicts in the sphere of consumption where all psychology belongs today from the schema of mass culture. 67. Social point of view. The conflict which was once located in the realm of the superfluous now appears itself as a luxury. Fashionable misfortune is its own consolation. In its mirror, mass culture is always the fairest in all the land. The self-reflection of culture brings a leveling down process in its wake, inasmuch as any and every product refers back to what has already been preformed. The mechanism of adjustment towards which business interest drives it anyway is imposed upon it once again. Whatever is to pass must already have been handled, manipulated and approved by hundreds of thousands of people before anyone can enjoy it. Loudspeakers are installed in the smallest of nightclubs to amplify the sound until it becomes literally unbearable. Everything is to sound like radio, like the echo of mass culture in all its might. The saxophones stand in pre-established harmony with the sound of canned music insofar as the instruments themselves manage to combine individual expression and mechanical standardization. Just as this is accomplished in principle throughout the process of mechanical reproduction, the digest has become a particularly popular form of literary distribution, and the average film now boasts of its similarity with the successful prototype rather than trying to conceal the fact. All mass culture is fundamentally adaptation. However, this adaptive character, the monopolistic filter which protects it from any external rays of influence which have not already been safely accommodated within its reified schema, represents an adjustment to the consumers as well. The predigested quality of the product prevails, justifies itself and establishes itself all the more firmly insofar as it constantly refers to those who cannot digest anything not already predigested. It is baby food, permanent self-reflection based upon the infantile compulsion towards the repetition of needs which it creates in the first place. Traditional cultural goods are treated in just the same way. Nothing is left of them except the crudest materials of political and cultural history in the luster of the great names handed down to us, those names to which all the top people of today cling with unconditional solidarity. Through constant contact with the sold-off spirit, amusement in turn is elevated until it degenerates into dutiful exercises in the appreciation of cultural values. The difference between serious and light culture is either eroded or expressly organized and thus incorporated into the 68. The culture industry, almighty totality. In the case of the socio-critical novels which are fed through the bestseller mechanism, we can no longer distinguish how far the horrors narrated in them serve the denunciation of society as opposed to the amusement of those who do not yet have the Roman circuses they are really waiting for. Schubert, polished up to the highest finish, now resembles Tchaikovsky or Rachmaninoff. Gershwin have derived their harmonic recipes from these sources and are accounted great art as a reward for having reconciled popular appeal with cultural distinction. There is no longer either kitsch or intransigent modernism in art. Advertising has absorbed surrealism, and the champions of this movement have given their blessing to this commercialization of their own murderous attacks on culture in the name of hostility to the same. Kitsch fares no better as hatred towards it becomes its very element. Sentimentality is robbed of its implausible character, of that touching but impotent utopian moment which for an instant might soften the hearts of those who have been hardened and take them beyond the reach of their even harder masters. The imported French director who cannot have too many bright ideas immediately takes back with glossy irony the tears almost as soon as they appear. To the jazzed up classics there now belong the screen actresses of grand passion who are undressed and depicted in compromising situations. No longer witnesses to passion, they are debased along with passion itself. The usual hazards of passion must play along with the universal fun. It is true that such exhibitions do not alter the acceptability or respectability of what is made fun of, with the sense of order characteristic of a dominant housewife careful watch is kept lest the realistic harmony between image and object be disturbed. This flotsam and jetsam of the 19th century to which we remain truer the more we mock the beards and the fashions of the past. The tradition in question is that of the comfortable second-hand realism of the humanly accessible which was formerly administered by feature journalism and purveyed on a big scale by essayists from St. Beauve right down down to Herbert Eulenberg. Art which informs us about reality was always accompanied by instructions for use which inform us about art, and today both have been conflated. Empathy with the object not only reconciles us with it but with every object. No one should think themselves better than they are. The viewer is persuaded of the merit of the schemer of mass culture. 69. His own averageness, and he may one day receive the supreme prize as Mr. Average Customer. Not even the oldest are repelled by the modernism of mass culture and its presentation. They pour into the cinema as avidly as they read the novels of Werfel or David Friedrich Strauss, who could write about Jesus as if he were Emil Ludwig even though he was wounded by nature's attacks. What he undertook on his own account today is performed irresistibly from above without any risk whatsoever. There is no longer a single idea which cannot be neutralized by recourse to the fate or psychology of its author, so that the latest doctor can bask in the claim that his hysterical wife resembles Queen Elizabeth I of England and his jealous colleagues resemble those of Paul Ehrlich. Not enough that faded aristocratic values are fed to the fraternal millions. They are simultaneously translated into egalitarian terms in the jargon of unlimited communication. Spiritual nobility of soul and the sense of fraternity have melted together into slogans for the workforce. But every individual product is leveled down in itself as well. There are no longer any real conflicts to be seen. They are replaced by the surrogate of shocks and sensations which seem to erupt from without and generally have no real consequences, smoothly insinuating themselves into the episodic action. The products are articulated in terms of episodes and adventures rather than in acts. The structure of the funnies is overtly reproduced in the women's serials and in more refined form in the Class A picture. The defective power of recall on the part of the consumer furnishes the point of departure. No one is trusted to remember anything that has already happened or to concentrate upon anything other than what is presented to him in the given moment. The consumer is thus reduced to the abstract present. Yet the more narrowly the moment is to vouch for itself, all the more must it also avoid being burdened with calamity. The viewer is supposed to be as incapable of looking suffering in the eye as he is of exercising thought. However, even more essential than transparent affirmation is the predetermined resolution and the happy ending of every tension whose purely apparent character is revealed by the ritual conclusion. Every specimen of mass culture in its very structure is as historical as the perfectly organized world of the future could wish it to be. It is the variety act, the techniques of which are clearly recalled by jazz and 70. The culture industry, film is the two most characteristic forms of mass culture. That provides the model here. It was certainly no accident that the variety act was once so prized by those avant-garde writers who were so critical of the liberal bourgeois work of art. That is, the work determined by the idea of conflict. What really constitutes the variety act, the thing which strikes any child the first time he sees such a performance, is the fact that on each occasion something happens and nothing happens at the same time. Every variety act, especially that of the clown and the juggler, is really a kind of expectation. It subsequently transpires that waiting for the thing in question, which takes place as long as the juggler manages to keep the balls going, is precisely the thing itself. In variety the applause always comes a fraction too late, namely when the viewer perceives that what was initially imagined to be a preparation for something else was just the event of which he has been cheated, as it were. The trick of the variety act consists in this betrayal of the temporal order, just as the event when it finally comes always displays a tendency to assume the character of a frozen pose or tableau, a symbolic suspension of the action to the accompaniment of the drum roll while all other music is stilled. Consequently the viewer who always comes too late can never be tardy after all. He jumps up as if to mount the merry-go-round, and in its first beginnings the cinema still resembled the fairground shooting booth that you entered as you chanced upon it. The major film is too good for this, of course, but by technical necessity and especially in its more respectable examples it is constantly driven in the same direction. However, the trick is played upon time itself and not merely upon the viewer. Thus variety already represented the magical repetition of the industrial procedure in which the self-same is reproduced through time. The very allegory of high capitalism which demonstrates its dominating character even as it appropriates its necessity as the freedom of play. Variety celebrates the paradoxical fact that in our advanced industrial epoch there is still such a thing as history, while its archetypes, the first chimney and the first top hat, already suggest the idea of technical control over time in which history comes to a standstill. Surrealism lives off the obsolescence of that which has no history and which presents itself as obsolescent, as if it had been destroyed by some catastrophe. This paradox is celebrated by the variety show, the act, the schemer of mass culture. 71. The performance becomes the model of mechanical repetition and thus absolves itself of its nugatory historicality. Perhaps it was this disenchanting truth in variety which outweighs any semblance of the historical, a semblance to which the bourgeois work of art still clung even in the advanced industrial age, which inspired Wedekind and Cocteau, Apollinaire and Kafka to praise the form so much. Impressionist music, a spurious synthesis of painting and music, imitated the procedure, and it was not for nothing that Debussy chose the variety act as one of his musical subjects. With Debussy, who described his most mature piano pieces as preludes and etudes, the inexperienced listener might well be tempted to take everything here as a prelude and wait for it all to begin, as with a firework display, which is what the last of the preludes is actually called. As the form which subsumed the heritage of impressionist music for the purposes of mass culture, jazz was never so faithful to that style of music as in this, that as has been noticed before in a jazz piece, all the moments which succeed one another in time are more or less directly interchangeable with one another, but there is no real development, and that what comes later is not one whit richer in experience than what has preceded it. Both variety and impressionism, objectively speaking, represented an attempt to render the concept of industrial procedure serviceable for the autonomous work of art, or to conceive of it, emancipated from every end, in abstracto as the pure domination of nature. In so far as they made mechanization their privileged theme as it were, they attempted like Chaplin to play a trick on it and transform the shock of the ever-same into a Bergsonian laughter. But mass culture falls victim to its preordained fate inasmuch as it adopts its law and simultaneously obscures it. Mass culture treats conflicts but in fact proceeds without conflict. The representation of living reality becomes a technique for suspending its development and thus comes to occupy that static realm which revealed the very essence of irreality. This can be seen in those sectors in which dynamic bourgeois art is subjected to adaptation. Simply by virtue of what it does to the original, the technique of mechanical reproduction as such already betrays the aspect of resistancelessness. Whatever problems of psychological fate the film may present, through parading the events past the viewer on the screen, the power of the oppositions involved in the possibility of freedom. 72. The culture industry, within them, is denied and reduced to the abstract temporal relationship of before and after. The eye of the camera which has perceived the conflict before the viewer and projected it upon the unresisting smoothly unfolding reel of FLM has already taken care that the conflicts are not conflicts at all. Insofar as the individual images are played past in an uninterrupted photographic series on the screen, they have already become mere objects in advance. Subsumed as they are, they pass us impotently by, like the child who reads an adventure story in the first person and is relieved to know that nothing has happened to the hero, since otherwise he would be unable to narrate his story in the first place. So it is to a certain extent with one who watches a filmed version of a novel as well. It is true that the hero may die, but he cannot at least instigate anything, and a filmed death is only half a death after all. It is similar with the biographies of great individuals. Nothing can happen to them which didn't happen to them anyway, and the finished story takes care of this. The historical accounts which so zealously exploit the fame of their heroic subjects decisively help to procure for them that Olympian existence which they had already been to assume with their translation into the pantheon. Certainly every finished work of art is already predetermined in some way, but art strives to overcome its own oppressive weight as an artifact through the force of its very construction. Mass culture, on the other hand, simply identifies with the curse of predetermination and joyfully fulfills it. Thus the technological changes which have been brought about with the advent of radio have inflicted a loss of history upon music. Even the performance ideal of serious music in the sense of a perfect account of the work that takes no risks, as this has developed under monopoly conditions, has fallen under an iron grip of rigidity despite the ostentatious appearance of dynamism. The performance of a symphony in which nothing can go wrong is also one in which nothing happens anymore either. The favored compositions of mass culture are specifically selected in accordance with this trend. The bestsellers here are the late romantics like Tchaikovsky and Dvorak, for whom the symphonic form is simply a face. They already weaken symphonic form by turning it into a potpourri of melodies arbitrarily connected with one another. The symphonic schema no longer performs any real function here, and all that is left of the dynamic fauna of the symphony, antiphonic motivic elaboration, the schema of mass culture. 73. And thematic development are the interludes of noisy excitement, which unpleasantly interrupt the potpourri until it is resumed as if nothing had happened, as if everything could begin all over again. The lack of conflict which in mass culture stems from the all-encompassing concerns of the monopoly can even be seen today in great art within those very works which most resolutely resist the cultural monopoly. Schoenberg's dodecaphonic technique has put in question the principle of development from which it first arose, and Brecht's epic theatre, which has taken to constructing conflict-specific ally for the purpose of social critique and for the sake of a materialist dialectic, has actually cancelled a dramatic dialectic. The idiosyncratic sensitivity towards the concept of climax is the most obvious explicit sign of this. The montage effects which Brecht introduced into drama implies the almost complete interchangeability of time, and the explicit captioning which refers to life and rise, for example, in the titles of his plays, seems to deprive the dramatic characters of action and transform them into experimental objects of a predetermined thesis. Thus, in spite of its discontinuous nature, this procedure comes to resemble the lack of resistance of cinematographic technique, just as in fact all Brecht's innovations could be read as an attempt to salvage the theatre in an age of film after the disintegration of psychology. This approach presupposes in the viewer, envisaged as someone smoking a case who is not supposed to be centrally moved, as a political issue, just that feebleness of thought and recall which mass culture has produced. Epic theatre is both a response to mass culture and mass culture's own reversed consciousness of itself. This theatre demonstrates how the relationship between the work of art and its immanent temporality is changing. The overcoming of time represented the most crucial concern of drama and symphonic music, as is revealed not only by the Aristotelian doctrine of the unity of time but by the actual procedures employed in the great dynamic works of art themselves. The empty passage of time, the meaningless transience of life, was to be seized upon through form and brought into participation with the idea by virtue of the totality of this form. It was precisely this thematization of time which allowed its heteronomy to be excluded from the aesthetic domain, and which permitted the artist to inject into the work of art at least the appearance of a timelessness. This appearance transformed the 74. The culture industry work into the essence and pure reflection of mere existence, and thus served to express transcendence. Conflict was the means by which time was overcome through sustaining intratemporal tension within the work. Conflict concentrates past and future in the present. Ibsen's dramaturgy expressed this with the formula: the measure of conflict is the power of the past, and the present is the threat of the future. In the very idea of drama, the interconnection of intratemporal moments becomes so condensed and the relationships between them so comprehensively articulated that the near passage of time takes on form and shape as a powerful configuration of meaningful relationships on the level of conflict before ultimately finding resolution. The temporality of absolute drama would be the instant which reveals itself in a flash from the crystallization of all the temporal relationships within the action. It is no different in the case of the symphony, which by means of its universal motivic elaboration, the musical equivalent for the dramatic dynamics of conflict, not merely fulfills its own time but actively imposes meaning upon it and causes it to disappear. Beethoven's Seventh Symphony provides an exemplary case of the dialectical arrest of time. Yet this intention has only ever represented one side of bourgeois art, the truth concerning the existence of prehistory, a truth which is constituted in reflection upon the timelessly governing unity of time. As timeless truth becomes a lie, as governing truth always becomes an injustice, and the dams it has erected are constantly and repeatedly broken by the time it has tried to exorcise. By virtue of its overcoming of time, art remains impotent really to accomplish the transcendence of existence and the mere commemoration of it. Consequently, the demand to transcend existence through the integration of time has always been accompanied by the other demand to renounce all preordained meaning and through an unfettered, as it were passive, empiricist abandonment to the temporal element which we have given up trying to master, and thus to allow this absence of meaning to emerge and reveal it precisely in its very negativity. The rest is silence. From Shakespeare's chronicle dramas through the struggles of Lessing and the Swiss school against classicist poetics right up to the psychological novel, this tendency, under the massive shadow of bourgeois culture, has become more and more powerful. Today it has sprung over into the two poles of the avant-garde on the one hand, the schema of mass culture, 75, and mass culture on the other. The last great novels, namely those of Proust and Joyce, surrender themselves so unreservedly to time that, time itself, the meaningless passing of which still constitutes the real content of the novel and Flaubert's work according to Lukács, now becomes as dissociated as the individuals who live through it. The renunciatory surrender to the purely temporal explodes the temporal continuum. The temporal moments into which the narrative has disintegrated now even begin to escape from the relationship of temporal succession and through the power of memory draw all temporal events back into themselves like a whirlpool. Finally, Brecht's dramatic procedure already presupposes the collapse of time as well as that of the individual. The epic element is supposed to cut through the intensive unity of the dramatic action and reveal its illusory and ideological character, but it is certainly not intended to replace the unity of action with that of the temporal continuum. The Brechtian drama is governed by a kind of time space, an experimental time which more closely resembles that of the repeatable laboratory's experiment than it does the time of history. It is true that this experimental time is no more protected from the eruption of empirical time than is its counterpart of dramatically contained time. For empirical time, which is the most profound expression of the relations of domination within the field of consciousness, persists as long as domination lasts and lies embedded in art itself because art is constituted in the protest against the time of fate. While such time is excluded by the relationship of spatial simultaneity created by the mounted scenes, it creeps into the conflictless succession of events. As long as drama in general remains bound to the principle of succession, it becomes all the more subject to abstract time the more resolutely it refuses to wrap up time by means of the dramatic action. Mass culture, which tolerates neither conflict nor any obvious form of montage, must pay tribute to time in every one of its products. This is the paradox of mass culture. The more ahistorical and preordained its procedures are, the less temporal relationships become a problem for it and the less it succeeds in transposing these relationships into a dialectical unity of temporal moments. The more craftily it employs static tricks to deceive us into seeing new temporal content in what it does, then the less it has left to oppose to the time beyond itself, and all the more fatally does it fall victim to that time. It's a historicality. 76. The cult of reindustrial Y is the tedium which it affects to relieve. It evokes the question whether or not the one-dimensional time which is characteristic of the blind course of history is even identical with the timelessness of the ever identical with fate. Same. Yet the liquidation of conflict in mass culture is not merely an arbitrary matter of manipulation. Conflict, intrigue and development, the crucial elements of autonomous literature and music, are unconditioned ally bourgeois as well. It is no accident that ever since the time of Attic comedy drama has looked for its intriguers among the bourgeois, as an attempt on the part of the powerless to acquire power through their own intelligence. Intrigue is the aesthetic cipher for the bourgeois triumph over the feudal order, the triumph of calculation and money over the static wealth of land and the immediate repression through armed force. The business and bustle of the intriguer, as this could still be perceived in the early period of great symphonic music in Haydn, in genially confident affirmative form before, with a critical turn, it came to constitute the essence of Beethovenian humor, originally derives from the unlimited effort demanded by competition, that zealous and conscientious industriousness which unintentionally put the noose around the neck of anyone who couldn't keep up. The intriguer is the negative image of the bourgeois individual and embodies the inevitable contradiction with solidarity that such an individual implies. Just as the hero and his spirit of freedom and sacrifice is supposed to represent the very same individual, they both belong to one another like two fragments of a broken world which have been welded together. One might almost say welded together like the bourgeois world and art itself. Today the life of both is at stake as they drive ever closer together. The hero no longer makes any sacrifices but now enjoys success. He does not come of age and assume freedom through his deeds, for his career is simply the revelation of his conformity. Thus he is the intriguer who has arrived, whose confiscated appearance reveals itself with all its irresistibility in the form of Clark Gable. Monopoly establishes the successful competitor in just the same way. Thus the petty intriguer disappears along with the small competitor. His conspiracy would only be a bankruptcy. His success is sanctioned as a fate which renders all action illusory and preordained. The last intriguers were the triumphant ones who helped bring the fascists to the schema of mass culture. 77. Reigns of power and established them firmly in the Kaiserhof through the secret dealings of the banker Schroeder, who advanced on Rome by sleeping car, and who took part in the murder of the old guard, in the Night of the Long Knives. Nobody is deceived by intrigue anymore now that its law has established itself directly in all its omnipotence. Mass art registers this fact inasmuch as it repudiates conflict as outmoded, or if it borrows it from the store of traditional culture, removes it from the realm of genuine spontaneity by predetermining its character. The bourgeois types generally associated with intrigue and conflict seem to appear in the prison clothing which they are supposed to have acquired in the liberal past. The word banker has become a term of abuse even in the United States, like lawyer and professional politician, and the dissatisfied ambitious woman fares no better when she is depicted as a vamp. Reporters and impresarios are still tolerated as comic relics. History is extruded from tales which have become cultural commodities, even and especially though where historical themes are exploited. History as such becomes a costume identified with the individual, concealing the frozen modernity of monopoly and state capitalism. Hence the emergence of that false reconciliation, the absorption of every negative counter-instance by an omnipotent reality, the elimination of dissonance and the bad totality. Lack of conflict within the work of art ensures that it can no longer endure any conflict with the life outside itself, because life banishes all conflicts into the deepest hidden places of suffering and keeps them out of sight with pitiless force. Aesthetic truth was bound to the expression of the untruth of bourgeois society. Art really only exists as long as it is impossible by virtue of the order which it transcends. That is why the existence of all the great forms of art is paradoxical, and more than all the others that of the novel, the bourgeois art form par excellence which the film has now appropriated for itself. Today, with the most extreme increase of real tension, the possibility of the work of art itself has become utterly questionable. Monopoly is the executor, eliminating tension. It abolishes art along with conflict. Only in this consummated conflictlessness does art wholly become one moment of material production and thus turn completely into the light to which it has always contributed its part in the past. Yet at the same time it here approaches more closely to the truth than those remnants. 78. The culture industry, of traditional art that still continue to flourish, to the extent that all preservation of individual conflict in the work of art, and generally even the introduction of social conflict as well, only serves as a romantic deception. It transfigures the world into one in which conflict is still possible rather than revealing it as one in which the omnipotent power of production is beginning ever more obviously to repress such a possibility. It is a delicate question whether the liquidation of aesthetic intrication and development represents the liquidation of every last trace of resistance or rather the medium of its secret omnipresence. One doesn't do that sort of thing, says the smart court official Brack when Hedda Gabler shoots herself. The monopoly now assumes his position. It disenchants conflict and the individual by means of its plain objectivity. Sacklage. The omnipresence of technology imprints itself upon objects and everything historical. The race of past suffering in men and things it tab zeros as kitsch. Prototypical here is the actress who manages to appear fresh and painstakingly made up with her hair perfectly arranged even in the midst of the most appalling dangers. In a tropical typhoon or in the clutches of white slave traders, she is so closely, so precisely and so pitilessly photographed that the magic which her makeup is intended to exert is heightened by the lack of illusion with which it is thrust before the viewer as literally true and unexaggerated. Mass culture is unadorned makeup. It assimilates itself to the realm of ends more than to anything else with a sober look that knows no nonsense. The new objectivity which it hates was developed in architecture. In this purposive domain it defended the aesthetic rights of purposiveness against the barbarism which the semblance of purposivelessness brings with it in that context. It has made standardization and mass production into a matter of art, where its opposite scorns every law form that is derived from without. The practical is all the more beautiful, the more it repudiates the semblance of beauty. But as soon as objectivity is wrenched free of ends, it degenerates into precisely that kind of ornamentation which it had originally denounced as a crime. Wherever film and radio abandon themselves to technocratic visions and utopian techniques, they resemble that advanced architecture before it made its peace with the world, when it still dishonestly struggled against it with all its might. If we wish to compare the mass-produced music Tin Pan Alley with architecture, the schema of mass culture. 79. We should not think of those plain new rows of dwellings but rather of the detached family houses which fill such a large part of older New England. Standardized mass products which even standardize the claim of each one to be irreplaceably unique, to be a villa of its own. It is not the standardization as such which makes these houses from the 19th century look so uncanny today as much as the relentless repetition of the unrepeatable. All those pillars and bay windows, little stairs and turrets. We can perceive this atmosphere of presentation in all its first bloom, and every product of mass culture in the process of consumption under monopolistic direction only reveals it all the more clearly year by year. Mass culture is incompatible with its own objectivity. It constantly refers back to materials whose essence resists such an objective presentation. At the same time it demonstrates its connection with the prevailing practice from the first by borrowing industrial methods through which it produces objectivity as style. The relationship between objectivity and the object itself is not an objective one. It is determined and disrupted by calculation. The perfection of the technical how, of trick and presentation, combined with the indispensable fatuity of the what, is the ultimate expression of this. The virtuosity of the jazz band which abandons itself to the 8-bar rhythms of the hit composer like a wild animal in a cage. The clever camera shots which can create all of the sensitive cloud effects of the 19th century novel. The frequency modulation which allows us to hear Gounod's Ave Maria with such astonishing clarity. All of this represents more than a mere disparity between moments that find themselves at different stages of development. The time lag itself arises out of the compulsive quid pro quo of dream and purposiveness in mass culture, just as old world German national costume and folk dancing were instigated not in spite of the reality of the tank but because of it. In a highly industrialized society, so it is argued by the new realists in the name of mass culture, the intellectual and cultural needs of the consumer adapt themselves to material needs. They are subject to exactly the same standardization, and it would surely be retrogressive to try and avoid this process, which is the technical presupposition of the realistic attitude. The Ford model and the model hit song are all of a piece, but the very thought of such adaptation already implies the acceptance of the manipulation of needs by the might of 80. The culture industry, production. Yet the spirit which is supposed to adapt itself in this way has the tendency and not merely the opportunity to resist such manipulation. The difference between practice and culture, upon which the monopoly lays such value by turning it into the administrative problem of coordinating the appropriate departments, consists precisely in the denial of co-ordination and the supremacy of those purposes dictated by the relations of production. Since in order to assert itself in its departmental character this coordinated culture must take account of this fact, it gets caught up in an irresolvable contradiction which it must constantly admit despite itself in every attempted evasion. Even the current hits, the most contemptible of standard products, have something immaterial as their subject. They all obey the absurd slogan which one of them once advertised as a title, especially for you. In view of such close interconnection, it is not enough merely to point out this ineliminable opposition between art and the real purposes from which such objective art adopts its standards. For mass art lives precisely from the fact that it maintains the opposition between practice and culture in a world where that opposition has become an ideology. Mass art falls victim to the realm of practice through its insistence over against material life upon the thing-like and fetishized character of the cultural goods which it has packed up and dispatched for use. Permanent self-reflection is good for it in this respect. On the other hand, that art which is seriously concerned with the critique of Bourdieu's purposiveness focuses upon a world which has been wholly claimed by purposiveness. It must measure itself against that world not only materially but in accordance with its own formal constitution. If objective art finds itself in danger of degrading its purposive forms into a false facade for the sake of its own purposivelessness, then non-objective art which avoids the transposition of purposive forms betrays a tendency towards the apologetic. Its poetry confidingly complements the jauntiness of its opposite, and thus both antagonistic schools get along amicably with one another. The Wiener works taught and such like right up to Rilke and T.S. Eliot with their attempts at the preservation of the soul are actually no further from monopoly capital than the stream. Lined products which nestle up to the soul all the more obligingly as its ornaments to the extent they imitate monopoly more literally. Every yellow-bound Austen novel, every FLM produces the required. The schema of mass culture. 8. Synthesis. The cracked surface of the commodities betrays the fracture of all art today. Responsible art sees itself confronted with a paradoxical choice. Either it develops purpose it forms so unrelentingly in their purposiveness that they come into open conflict with all external purposes when pursued to the bitter end, or it abandons itself so unreservedly to describing the existent without paying the slightest attention to special aesthetic considerations that its very refusal to intervene in the aesthetic formation of the object actually reveals itself as a pure law of form free of any decorative ingredients. Mass culture is not to be reproached for contradiction, any more than for its objective or non-objective character, but rather on account of the reconciliation which bars it from unfolding the contradiction into its truth. Its objectivity is not that which belongs to the immanent necessity of all the monuments in a work, but is merely the reflection of an objective style of life and perception. Its non-objective character on the other hand does not declare war upon the world of business but merely exploits its worn-out expressive schemata, the myth of personification and platitudes about humanity as a crude material resource. The objective practices are designed from the FRST to serve the promptness and precision of the information which is conveyed to the captive consumer, reduced as it is to the pursuit of cultural goods. The spirit demands that these goods themselves are not genuinely experienced. The consumer must only know how to deal with them in order to justify his claim to be a cultivated person. Even the solemn transmission of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, much publicized and impressively mounted as it is and never missing an opportunity to present itself as a truly historic event, is more concerned with instructing the listener about the event he is about to witness and the powers that have staged it than about encouraging him to participate in the work itself. The current practice of musical commentators who prefer talking about the history of the work's conception to telling us about the specific nature of its construction is tailored in advance to this tendency. What we are actually informed about is mass culture itself. All genuine experience of art is devalued into a matter of evaluation. The consumer is encouraged to recognize what is offered to him. The cultural object in question is represented as the finished product it has become, which now asks to be identified. This universal informational. 82. The culture and star Y. Character sets the seal upon the radical alienation between the consumer and the inescapable proximity of the product. He finds himself dependent upon information when his own experience proves inadequate, and the apparatus trains him to appear well informed on pain of losing prestige among other people and to renounce the more arduous process of real experience. If mass culture has already become one great exhibition, then everyone who stumbles into it feels as lonely as a stranger on an exhibition site. This is where information leaps in. The endless exhibition is also the endless bureau of information which forces itself upon the hapless visitor and regales him with leaflets, guides and radio recommendations, sparing each individual from the disgrace of appearing as stupid as everyone else. Mass culture is a system of signals that signals itself. The millions who belong to the Durklasses, formerly excluded from the enjoyment of cultural goods but now ensnared, provide a welcome pretext for this new orientation towards information. But this grandiose system of elucidation, transmission and rapid familiarization and the sudden shock of imposition destroys everything that the ideology of cultural products claims to promote so widely. The jokes which were made in the symptomatic program called Information Please not only express the truth about the system of information but also the truth about what the information is about. Information emphatically promotes the decay of the aesthetic image. Even the entertainment film becomes a newsreel and an extension of its own publicity. We learn what Lana Turner looks like in a sweater, how the latest cinematographic techniques of Orson Welles actually work, whether FM transmission is really so different from the old radio sound, the type of concert goer who only notices whether the piano is slightly out of tune or not, as a direct or indirect consumer of the latest innovations dispensed by the monopoly, has been turned into the ideal object for those cultural commodities which he has come to resemble so closely. The products are all the more respectable the more they recommend themselves to the world of information. They become unbearable on the other hand when they attempt to restore information as what is obscured by its over-illumination. Through aesthetic form giving in the work, information counts upon curiosity as the attitude with which the viewer approaches the product. The indiscretion formerly the schema of mass culture. 83. Prerogative of the most wretched of journalists has become part of the very essence of official culture. The information communicated by mass culture constantly winks at us. In an edition of millions the popular magazine disseminates its inside stories with an air of self-importance, and the camera concentrates upon every physical detail just as the old opera glasses used to do. With an illusionless mien and a bad conscience both wish to encourage the subject in the illusion that here too he is in on the act, that he is excluded nowhere. Heidegger accorded a place of honor to curiosity as an invariant feature in the fallenness of human existence, as a fundamental existential ontological constitution within the ontological tendency of everythingness. Although he clearly saw the function of curiosity as a cement of mass activity, probably expressing a diluted form of collective mimesis of the desire to equal everyone else by knowing everything about them, he nevertheless committed an injustice upon mankind by ascribing curiosity to man as such and virtually making the victim responsible rather than the jailkeeper. Whatever Aristotle knew about the intrinsic desire to see, today visibility is thrust upon everything that can possibly be seen. This is the anthropological sediment of that monopolistic compulsion to handle, to manipulate, to absorb everything, the inability to leave anything beyond itself untouched. The less the system tolerates anything new, the more those who have been forsaken must be acquainted with all the latest novelties if they are to continue living in society rather than feeling themselves excluded from it. Mass culture allows precisely this reserve army of outsiders to participate. Mass culture is an organized mania for connecting everything with everything else, a totality of public secrets. Everyone everyone who is informed has his share in the secret, just as under National Socialism the privilege of esoteric blood brotherhood was actually offered to everyone. But the tendency towards extortion in which both curiosity and indiscretion find their fulfillment is a part of that violence which the fascist is always ready to employ against the underprivileged. The satisfaction of curiosity by no means serves only the psychological economy of the subject, but directly serves material interests as well. Those who have been thoroughly informed lend themselves to thorough utilization. The German hit song from the era of incipient fascism Kannst du tanzen, Joanna, 84. The culture industry, Jewish kann ich das, can you dance, Joanna, I certainly can, in which the erotic accomplishments of the object of desire appear as qualities in a saturated labor market, has preserved this historical aspect of curiosity in a particularly drastic form. Such curiosity belongs to those deformations of human behavior produced by the market economy which have become independent since the demise of the latter and attained a diseased pitch of irrationality. In the epoch of total antisemitism, everyone has chosen Little Moritz as an idol. This has become an institution among the quiz kids and their ilk. This curiosity is perfectly attuned to the information which in turn socializes curiosity. It refers constantly to what has been preformed, to what others already know. To be informed about something implies an enforced solidarity with what has already been judged. We agree with the majority about it, yet simultaneously we wish to deprive them of it and take possession of it ourselves, with the gesture for which one is always prepared and which exercises a dictatorial power from the joke to the social research project, namely that but we know that already. One doesn't merely ingratiate oneself with the system personally, one also simultaneously disparages anyone who tries to persuade us of inconvenient facts which are devalued instantly since we know them ourselves already. Curiosity is the enemy of the new which is not permitted to exist anyway. It lives off the claim that there cannot be anything new and that what presents itself as new is already predisposed to subsumption on the part of the well-informed. The passionate intensity with which curiosity comes on the scene squanders in the process of reproduction and appropriation the very power which might have contributed to the experience or the creation of something really new. The blindness of this passion renders the data towards which it is directed indifferent and irrelevant. However useful it might be from a practical point of view to have as much information as possible at one's disposal, there still prevails the iron law that the information in question shall never touch the essential, shall never degenerate into thought. This is ensured by the restriction of informity on to what the monopoly has supplied, to commodities, or to those people whose function in the business world has turned them into commodities. But as if this were not enough, there is a taboo against inaccurate information, a charge that can be invoked against any. The schemer of mass culture. 85. Thought. The curiosity for information cannot be separated from the opinionated mentality of those who know it all. Today the curious individual becomes a nihilist. Anything that cannot be recognized, subsumed and verified he rejects as idiocy or ideology, as subjective in the derogatory sense. But what he already knows and can identify becomes valueless in the process. Mere repetition. So much wasted time and money. This aporia of mass culture and the science affiliated to it reduces its victims to its own kind of praxis, namely a blunted perseverance. But this hopeless figure of curiosity is wholly determined by the monopoly. The attitude of the well-informed derives from that of the buyer who knows his way about the market. To this extent it is directly related to the advertising business. Advertising becomes information when there is no longer anything to choose from, when the recognition of brand names has taken the place of choice, when at the same time the totality forces everyone who wishes to survive into consciously going along with the process. This is what happens under monopolistic mass culture. We can distinguish three stages in the developing domination of needs: advertising, information and command. As a form of omnipresent familiarization, mass culture dissolves these stages into one another. The curiosity which it kindles brutally reproduces out of the child which already derives from compulsion, deception and renunciation. The child becomes curious when its parents refuse to provide it with genuine information. It is not that original desire to look with which ontologies ancient and modern have obscurely connected it, but a gaze narcissistically turned upon itself. The curiosity which transforms the world into objects is not objective. It is not concerned with what is known but with the fact of knowing it, with knowledge as a possession. This is precisely how the objects of information are organized today. Their indifferent character predestines their being and they are incapable of transcending the abstract fact of possession through any eminent quality of their own. As facts they are arranged in such a way that they can be grasped as quickly and easily as possible. Wrenched from all context, detached from thought, they are made instantly accessible to an infantile grasp. They may never be broadened out in any way but like favorite dishes they must obey the rule of identity if they are not to be rejected as false or alien. They must always. 86. The cult of Reinvestar be accurate but never true. Thus they tend towards deceit and the journalists cannot and the feeble invented anecdotes of the radio reporter are merely an explosion of the untruth which already lies within the blindness of the facts themselves. The curious individual who falls victim here, the raving autograph chaser at the film studio, the child under fascism who suffers under the newfangled disease of compulsive reading, is simply the citizen who has come to consciousness of himself. The person who has learned how to come to terms with reality and whose apparent insanity merely confirms the objective insanity which men have finally succeeded in catching up with. The more participation in mass culture exhausts itself in the informed access to cultural facts, the more the culture business comes to resemble contests, those aptitude tests which check suitability and performance, and finally sport, while the consumers are tirelessly encouraged to compete, whether by virtue of the way in which goods are offered to them or through the techniques of advertising. The products themselves right down to the details of technical procedure begin to exhibit sport-like characteristics. They require extreme accomplishments that can be exactly measured. The task of the screen actor breaks down into a set of precisely defined obligatory exercises, each of which is compared with the corresponding one in the work of all the other competitors in the same group. And then in the end we have the final spurt, the ultimate exertion which has been kept in reserve all along, the culmination without antecedent intensification isolated from the previous action, the opposite of the dramatic simux. The film is articulated into so many sequences but its total duration, like that of the hit song, is regulated as if by stopwatch. In a space of 1.5 hours the film should have knocked out its audience as planned. The detective story actually organizes a match not merely between criminal and detective but between author and reader as well. The paradigm of this cultural sport is a competition, that ancient challenging of few feudal style and bourgeois spirit. Here the integrity of memory, the substance of individuality, is fragmented and torn from the protective cover of oblivion, caught up in the dynamics of exchange value and free competition and finally disposed of as supposed knowledge. The wretched fate here is like that which befalls the joke specially committed to paper so that we can remember it. The bourgeois citizen comes to terms with the schema of mass culture. 87. Spirit by inscribing it among the world of facts. It all comes down to making himself sufficiently like that world on the one hand while, as a small property owner, making a sufficient bed to lie on out of it on the other. He knows such a lot as they say. This knowledge is then tried and tested in competitions. Mass culture has finally rewritten the whole of Hegel's phenomenology of spirit in accordance with the principle of the competition. The sensuous moment of art transforms itself under the eyes of mass culture into the measurement, comparison and assessment of physical phenomena. This is most clearly to be seen in the case of jazz, which is directly indebted to the sport of competitive dancing, although it has gone its own independent way by pursuing this debt far beyond the real possibilities of the dance. If we may seek the enjoyment of the dancer at a jazz event in the obsession with syncopation as the very formula of his own crippling which he does not allow to confuse him about his collective function, then the enjoyment of the jazz player should be compared with that of the sportsman who also labors under testing self-imposed conditions. All bourgeois art has preserved this moment in the phenomenon of the virtuoso performer. The bourgeois class demands something astonishing, something mechanical which I cannot offer them. The refined and much-traveled world is arrogant but also cultivated and discriminating when it is prepared to consider something more closely. But it is so occupied with 1,000 other things, so imprisoned in its conventional tedium, that it is a matter of complete indifference to it whether the music which it insists on hearing from morning till night is good or bad. Degree so wrote Chopin in 1848. In the last 100 years since then the bourgeois class has quite lost the privilege of not having to listen to music all the time, although it has not relinquished the need for mechanical and astonishing display. It is simply the case that this need has become so universally widespread that the mechanical moment has utterly consumed the element of the astonishing. The romantic dissolution of the preconceived unity into its details, something which once pressed the right of the individual against the inflexibility of the totality, nevertheless harbored its opposite, the process of mechanization. In its very principle, the emancipated detail first becomes an effect and finally a trick. Under the sign of such details the work of art has fallen into the hands of competing specialists, a victim of that division of labor. 88. The culture industry, whose hegemony it tries to challenge. The original, authentically, bourgeois reduction of truth to what we have the power to do, as Bacon formulated the idea, affects the content of the work of art. This content is sought in the fabrication of the work itself. Social production as such is glorified, and the untruth of this form of production, the cult of labor conspicuously embodied in consumer goods, conceals the appropriation of its own surplus value in the products. When mass culture exhibits itself, it also loves to show how its products are made and how everything in it functions. For the citizen, the free capacity to produce replaces the idea of a life free from domination, and he seeks in the world of achievement the human significance that this realm specifically denies him. Virtuosity, which can yet never be detached wholly from art to the extent that a moment of nature domination in his and all art, has always pointed towards accomplishment and achievement. In mass culture such virtuosity is all that remains. In this respect, of course, it differs fundamentally from the virtuosity which was characteristic of an earlier liberal century. Ultimate achievement now consists not in triumphing over difficulty but in a process of subordination. It produces an aesthetic attitude which cannot be disturbed by external contingency or any other obtrusive factors. Whenever possible, the disturbing factors are expressly produced without master the alien elements as something not already preformed, and thus establish its rule from out of freedom itself. If the piano virtuoso still recalled the acrobat or the juggler, who would only appear for money after the most arduous preparation, the jazz musician, without entirely relinquishing these models, comes more and more to resemble the goalkeeper. The virtues required of him are undistractability, attention, preparedness and concentration. He becomes an improviser in a compulsory situation. The illusionlessness of his performance is turned into that sporting facility which consists in being unsettled by nothing. Nothing is more frowned upon than rubato. Under monopoly Condi shines the heir to the virtuoso is he who accommodates himself most efficiently to the team. Insofar as he does stand out personally in any way, this is regulated by the function which he performs in the team, in the ideal case by facing himself, leaping to save a goal and thus serving the collective. The jazz musician and everyone in front of the end allowing any longer the image of an autonomy which might. The schema of mass culture. 89. Microphone or the camera are forced to inflict violence upon themselves. Indeed, the most rewarded are those who do not even require this violence to be exercised upon them in the first place. Those who are so utterly compliant with the expected behavior that they can even simulate the signs of resistance spontaneously precisely because they no longer feel such resistance in themselves. The sporting events from which the schema of mass culture borrows so many of its features and which represent one of its favorite themes have divested themselves of all meaning. They are nothing but what they are. So it is that sportification has played its part in the dissolution of aesthetic semblance. Sport is the imageless counterpart to practical life, and aesthetic images increasingly participate in this imagelessness the more they turn into a form of sport themselves. Indeed, one might perceive in this an anticipation of a kind of play which in a classless society might do away with semblance along with the principle of utility whose complement it is. But if in fact the principles of the classless society do mature under the conditions of monopoly capitalism, they certainly do not do so in such a way that they only need liberating from the fetters of domination before being realized. Monopoly does not merely abuse these principles but actually inhabits them. They contain future possibilities mediated by the unbearable opposition which is still burned into the traces of freedom. Sport itself is not play but ritual in which the subjected celebrate their subjection. They parody freedom in their readiness for service, a service which the individual forcibly exacts from his own body for a second time. In the freedom which he exercises over his body, the individual confirms what he is by inflicting upon this slave the same injustice he has already endured at the violent hands of society. The passion for sport, in which the masters of mass culture sense the real mass basis of their dictatorial power, is grounded in this fact. One can play the master by inflicting the original pain upon oneself and others again symbolically through a kind of compulsive repetition. While the act of repetition schools obedience, it absorbs the fateful damage in the perpetual potential for anxiety, and so it continues. At the same time, the borderline between acting and suffering, between internal and external force, is eliminated in the symbolic performance. This is the school for that integration which finally succeeded politically in 90. The culture industry, transforming the powerless into a band of applauding hooligans. 1 is allowed to inflict pain according to the rules. 1 is maltreated according to the rules, and the rule checks strength in order to vindicate weakness as strength. The screen heroes enjoy being tortured on film. The rules of the game resemble those of the market. Equal chances and fair play for all, but only as the struggle of all against all. Thus it is that sport permits competition, now reduced to a form of brutality, to survive in a world in which competition has actually been eliminated. While sport does indeed express competition as a form of immediate activity, it also expressly thematizes a historical tendency which has done away with competition proper. From being a kind of deception or trick practiced upon others, it has become a coup. But the record achievements in which sport culminates already proclaim the undisguised law of the strongest, which arises so naturally from the competitive domain precisely because it has always dominated that domain so relentlessly. In the triumph of this practical spirit, far as it is from the acquisitive pursuit of the necessities of life, sport becomes a pseudo-praxis in which those who are practically active are no longer capable of helping themselves but now turn themselves once again into the objects they have already become. In its naked literalness, in the brutish seriousness which hardens every gesture of play into an automatic reflex, sport becomes the colorless reflection of a hard and callous life. Sport only preserves the joy of movement, the thought of bodily liberation, the suspension of practical ends in a completely external distorted form. Yet perhaps because the violence which sport inflicts upon people might help them towards understanding how they could one day finally put an end to violence itself, mass culture takes sport into custody. Even if the sportsman might possibly be able to develop certain virtues like solidarity, readiness to help others, or even enthusiasm which could prove valuable in critical political moments, nothing of this kind is to be found in the spectator. Here a crude contemplative curiosity replaces the last traces of spontaneity. But mass culture is not interested in turning its consumers into sportsmen as such, but only into howling devotees of the stadium. Insofar as mass culture reflects the totality of life as a complete system of open or covert sportive competitive struggles, it enthrones sport as life itself and even eliminates the tension between sport on the Sunday day off. The schema of mass culture. 9. And the wretchedness of the working week, a tension in which the better part of sport used to consist. This is what it achieves with the final liquidation of aesthetic semblance. Mass culture even neutralizes this pseudo-praxis into the image quality which is simultaneously renounced in the sportification of the product. Under monopoly conditions, the more life forces anyone who wishes to survive into deceit, trickery and insinuation, and the less the individual can depend any longer upon a stable profession for his living, upon the continuity of labor, then all the greater becomes the might of sport in mass culture and the outside world in general. Mass culture is a kind of training for life when things have gone wrong. The schema of mass culture now prevails as a canon of synthetically produced modes of behavior. The following, which mass culture can still count on even their wet tedium and deception, seem almost calculated to provoke the consumers, is held together by the hope that the voice of the monopoly will tell them as they wait in line precisely what is expected of them if they want to be clothed and fed. The first commandment, of course, is that one should already be properly dressed and tolerably well fed. The good manners which the system teaches them presupposes all this. Anyone who fails openly to parade their freedom, their courtesy, their sense of security, who fails to observe and propagate the established guidelines, is forced to remain outside the pale. It is not so much that misery is concealed in the medium of film, for example, indeed it is often enough depicted with some relish, but that the viewer is taught to behave everywhere as if there really were no such thing. In spite of all sententious humanitarianism, the obedient adept becomes ever colder, harder and more pitiless. The more industry exhausts what has already been perverted into commodities in the very name of culture, the more the omnipresence of culture proclaims itself. The shots of leading figures in economic life and other prominent people in their straw hats and padded suits can only be distinguished from those of gangsters by the fact that they take their hats off when they enter the room while they exploit the robust speech of the gangster for the sake of popularity. Thus they prepare the fata morgana of a fine society, which once again reinforces in the medium of the image the actual destruction of society proper in the transformation of its members into the mannequins of the society page, even as it. 92. The culture industry denies them. Mass culture only recognizes refined people. Even the slang of the street kids that can never be reproduced too realistically merely serves to ensure that the laughing viewer is never tempted to use such language himself. The totality of mass culture culminates in the demand that no one can be any different from itself. The scientific tests upon which employment depends simply follow its example in this. The monopoly shuts its doors on anyone who fails to learn from the cinema how to move and speak according to the schema which it has fabricated. Because of their position in the productive process, women are particularly susceptible in this respect, and this may partially explain why they are so dependent upon the dismal pleasures of screen entertainment. The old slogan of bourgeois entertainment, "But you must have seen this," which just represented a swindle in the marketplace, becomes a matter of deadly seriousness with the elimination of amusements in the market alike. Formerly the supposed penalty merely lay in not being able to participate in what everyone else was talking about. Today anyone who is incapable of talking in the prescribed fashion, that is of effortlessly reproducing the formulas, conventions and judgments of mass culture as if they were his own, is threatened in his very existence, suspected of being an idiot or an intellectual, looking good, makeup, the desperately strained smile of eternal youth which only cracks momentarily in the angry twitching of the wrinkles of the brow. All this bounty is dispensed by the personnel manager under threat of the stick. People give their approval to mass culture because they know or suspect that this is where they are taught the mores they will surely need as their passport in a monopolized life. This passport is only valid if paid for in blood, with the surrender of life as a whole and the impassioned obedience to a hated compulsion. This is why mass culture proves so irresistible, and not because of the supposed stultification of the masses which is promoted by their enemies and lamented by their philanthropic friends. The psychological mechanisms involved are secondary. Today the rationality of adjustment has already reached such a point that the slightest jolt would be sufficient to reveal its irrationality. The renunciation of resistance is ratified by regression. The masses draw the correct conclusion from their complete social powerlessness over against the monopoly which represents their misery today. Through this, the schema of mass culture, adjustment to the technical forces of production, an adjustment which the system imposes upon them in the name of progress, men become objects that can be manipulated without further objection and thus fall far behind the potential which lies in the technical forces of production. But since as subjects men themselves still represent the ultimate limit of reification, mass culture must try and take hold of them again and again. The bad infinity involved in this hopeless effort of repetition is the only trace of hope that this repetition might be in vain, that men cannot wholly be grasped after all. As a focus of regression, mass culture assiduously concerns itself with the production of those archetypes in whose survival fascistic psychology perceives the most reliable means of perpetuating the modern conditions of domination. Primeval symbols are constructed on the production line. The dream industry does not so much fabricate the dreams of the customers as introduce the dreams of the suppliers among the people. This is the thousand-year empire of an industrial caste system governed by a stream of never-ending dynasties. In the dreams of those in charge of mummifying the world, mass culture priestly hieroglyphic script which addresses its images to those who have been subjugated not in order that they might be enjoyed but only that they be read. The authentic images of the film screen as well as the inauthentic ones encountered in hid melodies and the well-worn written phrase appear so rigidly and so frequently that they are no longer perceived in their own right but only as repetitions whose perpetual sameness always expresses an identical meaning. The looser the connection in the sequence of events or the development of the action, the more the shattered image becomes an allegorical seal. Even from the visual point of view, the sudden evanescent images of the cinema come to resemble a sort of script. The images are seized but not contemplated. The film reel draws the eye along just like a line of writing and it turns the page with a gentle jolt of every scene change. On occasion aesthetically crafted films like Guitry's Perils de la Couronne have emphasized this book-like character of the film as an explicit framework. Thus the technology of the mass work of art accomplishes that transition from image to writing in which the absorption of art by monopolistic practice culminates. But the secret doctrine which is communicated here is the message of capital. It must be secret because represents 93, 94. The culture industry, total domination, likes to keep itself invisible, no shepherd or herd. Nonetheless it is directed at everyone. Its meaning has little to do with the ephemeral character of the cultural product and the very frailty of this product calls out to be deciphered. When a film presents us with a strikingly beautiful young woman, it may officially approve or disapprove of her. She may be glorified as a successful heroine or punished as a vamp. Yet as a rhythm character she announces something quite different from the psychological banners draped around her grinning mouth, namely the injunction to be like her. The new context into which these pre-prepared images enter as so many letters is always that of the command. The viewer is required constantly to translate the images back into writing. The exercise of obedience is in the fact of translation itself as soon as it takes place automatically. The more the film goer, the hit song enthusiast, the reader of detective and magazine stories anticipates the outcome, the solution, the structure and so on, the more his attention is displaced towards the question of how the nugatory result is achieved, to the rebus-like details involved, and in this searching process of displacement the hieroglyphic meaning suddenly reveals itself. It articulates every phenomenon right down to the subtlest nuance according to a simplistic two-term logic of dos and don'ts, and by virtue of this reduction of everything alien and unintelligible it overtakes the consumers. The emergence of this tendency towards the hieroglyphic represents a decisive stage in the previous history of mass culture, for it marks the transition from the silent film to the sound FLM. In the older type of film, images and written signs still alternated with one another and the antithesis of the two lent emphasis to the image character of the images. But this dialectic, like every other, was unbearable to mass culture. It has expelled writing from the film as an alien presence but only to transform the images themselves completely into the writing which they have then absorbed in turn. Chaplin's patient sabotage of sound film, especially the forlorn neon light advertisement with which he prefaced Modern Times, proved itself as a conscious expression of this process in the medium itself. But the speaking images are only masks. The phenomenon of this latest pictorial script is the same as the oldest of all. Through fixation the mask transforms what is utterly unthing-like expression itself into horror over the fact that a human face can be so arrested, and then, the schema of mass culture, 95, transforms the horror into obedience before the mortified face. That is the secret of the keep smiling attitude. The face becomes a dead letter by freezing the most living thing about it, namely its laughter. The film fulfills the old children's threat of the ugly grimace which freezes when the wind changes or the clock strikes. And here it strikes the hour of total domination. The masks of the film are so many emblems of authority. Their horror grows to the extent that these masks are able to move and speak, although this does nothing to alter their inexorability. Everything that Ives is captured in such masks. As far as mass culture is concerned, reification is no metaphor. It makes the human beings that it reproduces resemble things even where their teeth do not represent toothpastes and their careworn wrinkles do not evoke cosmetics. Whoever goes to a film is only waiting for the day when this spell will be broken, and perhaps ultimately it is only this well-concealed hope which draws people to the cinema. But once there they obey, they assimilate themselves to what is dead, and that is how they become disposable. Mimesis explains the enigmatically empty ecstasy of the fans in mass culture. Ecstasy is the motor of imitation. It is this rather than self-expression and individuality which forcibly produces the behavior of the victims which recalls Saint Vitus's dance with the motor reflex spasms of the maimed animal. The gestures are not identical with those in transports of ecstasy, and yet they are the most impassionate expression of these same human beings. Under the force of immense pressure the identity of the personality gives way, and since this identity itself already originates in pressure, this is felt as a liberation. When people dance to jazz, for example, they do not dance for sensuous pleasure or in order to obtain release. Rather they merely depict the gestures of sensuous human beings. Just as in a film, individual allegorical gestures on their own represent modes of behavior in general, and that is precisely the release. They fasten on the culture masks proffered to them and practice themselves the magic which is already worked upon them. They become a collective through the adaptation to an overmastering arbitrary power. The terror for which the people of every land are being prepared glares ever more threateningly from the rigid features of these culture masks. In every peal of laughter we hear the menacing voice of extortion, and the comic types are legible signs signs which represent the contorted bodies of 96. The culture industry, revolutionaries. Participation in mass culture itself stands under the sign of terror. Enthusiasm not merely betrays an unconscious eagerness to read the commands from above but already reveals a fear of disobedience, of those unconventional desires from the suspicion of which the sex murderer who kills his own beloved passionately strives to cleanse himself. This anxiety, the ultimate lesson of the fascist era, is already harbored within the very medium of technological communication. Anyone who has not yet been wholly inured by the oppressive self-importance of big business is unnerved to receive a telegram. The mutilated language condensed to carry the maximum information combined with the urgency of delivery imparts the shock of immediate domination in the form of immediate horror. The fear of the disaster which the telegram might announce is only a mantle for the fear of the omnipresent disasters that can overtake us at any time. Above all, on the radio, the authority of society standing behind every speaker immediately addresses its listeners and challenged. If indeed the advances of technology largely determine the fate of society, then the technicized forms of modern consciousness are also heralds of that fate. They transform culture into a total lie, but this untruth confesses the truth about the socio-economic base with which it has now become identical. The neon signs which hang over our cities and outshine the natural light of the night with their own are comets presaging the natural disaster of society. It's frozen death. Yet they do not come from the sky. They are controlled from Earth. It depends upon human beings themselves whether they will extinguish these lights and awake from a nightmare which only threatens to become actual as long as men believe in it. Notes. 1. In the attempt to denounce class society in a non-psychological manner, the best Russian films, above all Battleship Potemkin, have not actually depicted the process of material production at all but the realities of war and of political, military oppression. They maintain aesthetic concreteness by showing what is immediately inflicted upon human beings rather than by depicting what takes place in the abstract order of property relations. But insofar as these films present men as objects of domination who become subjects in the struggle against such domination, they penetrate to what is essential, the success of the schema of mass culture. 97. Such films is of a highly paradoxical and precarious kind when we 3. Culture industry reconsidered. The term culture industry was perhaps used for the first time in the book Dialectic of Enlightenment, which Horkheimer and I published in Amsterdam in 1947. In our draft we spoke of mass culture. We replaced that expression with culture industry in order to exclude from the outset the interpretation agreeable to its advocates, that it is a matter of something like a culture that arises spontaneously from the masses themselves. The contemporary form of popular art. From the latter the culture industry must be distinguished in the extreme. The culture industry fuses the old and familiar into a new quality, in all its branches. Products which are tailored for consumption by masses, and which to a great extent determine the nature of that consumption, are manufactured more or less according to plan. The individual branches are similar in structure or at least fit into each other, ordering themselves into a system almost without a gap. This is made possible by contemporary technical capabilities as well as by economic and administrative concentration. The culture industry intentionally integrates its consumers from above. To the detriment of both, it forces together the spheres of high and low art, separated for thousands of years. The seriousness of high art is destroyed in speculation about its culture industry reconsidered. 99. Efficacy. The seriousness of the lower perishes with the civilizational constraints imposed on the rebellious resistance inherent within it as long as social control was not yet total. Thus, although the culture industry undeniably speculates on the conscious and unconscious state of the millions towards which it is directed, the masses are not primary, but secondary. They are an object of calculation, an appendage of the machinery. The customer is not king, as the culture industry would have us believe, not its subject but its object. The very word mass media, specially honed for the culture industry, already shifts the accent onto harmless terrain. Neither is it a question of primary concern for the masses, nor of the techniques of communication as such, but of the spirit which sufflets them, their master's voice. The culture industry misuses its concern for the masses in order to duplicate, reinforce and strengthen their mentality, which it presumes is given and unchangeable. How this mentality might be changed is excluded throughout. The masses are not the measure but the ideology of the culture industry, even though the culture industry itself could scarcely exist without adapting to the masses. The cultural commodities of the industry are governed, as Brecht and Surkamp expressed it 30 years ago, by the principle of their realization as value, and not by their own specific content and harmonious formation. The entire practice of the culture industry transfers the profit motive naked onto cultural forms. Ever since these cultural forms first began to earn a living for their creators as commodities in the marketplace, they had already possessed something of this quality, but then they sought after profit only indirectly, over and above their autonomous essence. New on the part of the culture industry is the direct and undisguised primacy of a precisely and thoroughly calculated efficacy in its most typical products. The autonomy of works of art, which of course rarely ever predominated in an entirely pure form, and was always permeated by a constellation of effects, is tendentially eliminated by the culture industry, with or without the conscious will of those in control. The latter include both those who carry out directives as well as those who hold the power. In economic terms, they are or were in search of new opportunities for the realization of capital in the most economically developed countries. The old opportunities became increasingly more precarious as a result of the same concentration. To zero the culture industry, process which alone makes the culture industry possible as an omnipresent phenomenon. Culture, in the true sense, did not simply accommodate itself to human beings, but it always simultaneously raised them by honoring them. Insofar as culture becomes wholly assimilated to and integrated in those petrified relations, human beings are once more debased. Cultural entities typical of the culture industry are no longer also commodities. They are commodities through and through. This quantitative shift is so great that it calls forth entirely new phenomena. Ultimately, the culture industry no longer even needs to directly pursue everywhere the profit interests from which it originated. These interests have become objectified in its ideology and have even made themselves independent of the compulsion to sell the cultural commodities which must be swallowed anyway. The culture industry turns into public relations, the manufacturing of goodwill per se, without regard for particular firms or saleable objects. Brought to bear is a general uncritical consensus. Advertisements produced for the world, so that each product of the culture industry becomes its own protest against the petrified relations under which they lived. Advertisement. Nevertheless, those characteristics which originally stamped the transformation of literature into a commodity are maintained in this process. More than anything in the world, the culture industry has its ontology, a scaffolding of rigidly conservative basic categories which can be gleaned, for example, from the commercial English novels of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. What parades as progress in the culture industry, as the incessantly new which it offers up, remains the disguise for an eternal sameness. Everywhere the changes mask a skeleton which has changed just as little as the profit motive itself since the time it first gained its predominance over culture. Thus, the expression industry is not to be taken too literally. It refers to the standardization of the thing itself, such as that of the Western, familiar to every moviegoer, and to the rationalization of distribution techniques, but not strictly to the production process. Although in film, the central sector of the culture industry, the production process resembles technical modes of operation in the extensive division of labor, the employment of machines and the separation of culture industry reconsidered too, the laborers from the means of production, expressed in the perennial conflict between artists active in the culture industry and those who control it. Individual forms of production are nevertheless maintained. Each product affects an individual air. Individuality itself serves to reinforce ideology, insofar as the illusion is conjured up that the completely reified and mediated is a sanctuary from immediacy and life. Now, as ever, the culture industry exists in the service of third persons, maintaining its affinity to the declining circulation process of capital, to the commerce from which it came into being. Its ideology above all makes use of the star system, borrowed from individualistic art and its commercial exploitation. The more dehumanized its methods of operation and content, the more diligently and successfully the culture industry propagates supposedly great personalities and operates with heartthrobs. It is industrial more in a sociological sense, in the incorporation of industrial forms of organization even when nothing is manufactured, as in the rationalization of office work, rather than in the sense of anything really and actually produced by technological rationality. Accordingly, the misinvestments of the culture industry are considerable, throwing those branches rendered obsolete by new techniques into crises, which seldom led to changes for the better. The concept of technique in the culture industry is only in name identical with technique in works of art. In the latter, technique is concerned with the internal organization of the object itself, with its inner logic. In contrast, the technique of the culture industry is, from the beginning, one of distribution and mechanical reproduction, and therefore always remains external to its object. The culture industry finds ideological support precisely insofar as it carefully shields itself from the full potential of the techniques contained in its products. It lives parasitically from the extra-artistic technique of the material production of goods, without regard for the obligation to the internal artistic whole implied by its functionality, saclichkeit, but also without concern for the laws of form demanded by aesthetic autonomy. The result for the physiognomy of the culture industry is essentially a mixed array of streamlining, photographic hardness and precision on the one hand, and individualistic residues, sentimentality and an already rationally disposed and adapted romanticism on the other. Adopting T02 the culture industry, Benjamin's designation of the traditional work of art by the concept of aura, the presence of that which is not present. The culture industry is defined by the fact that it does not strictly counterpose another principle to that of aura, but rather by the fact that it conserves the decaying aura as a foggy mist. By this means the culture industry betrays its own ideological abuses. It has recently become customary among cultural officials as well as sociologists to warn against underestimating the culture industry while pointing to its great importance for the development of the consciousness of its consumers. It is to be taken seriously, without cultured snobism. In actuality the culture industry is important as a remnant of the spirit which dominates today. Whoever ignores its influence out of skepticism for what it stuffs into people would be naive, yet there is a deceptive glitter about the admonition to take it seriously, because of its social role, disturbing questions about its quality, about truth or untruth, and about the aesthetic niveau of the culture industry as MS. Science are repressed, or at least excluded from the so-called sociology of communications. The critic is accused of taking refuge in arrogant esoterica. It would be advisable first to indicate the double meaning of importance that slowly worms its way in unnoticed, even if it touches the lives of innumerable people. The function of something is no guarantee of its particular quality. The blending of aesthetics with its residual communicative aspects leads art, as a social phenomenon, not to its rightful position in opposition to alleged artistic snobism, but rather in a variety of ways to the defense of its baneful social consequences. The importance of the culture industry in the spiritual constitution of the masses is no dispensation for reflection on its objective legitimation, its essential being, least of all by a science which thinks itself pragmatic. On the contrary, such reflection becomes necessary, precisely for this reason. To take the culture industry as seriously as its unquestioned role demands, means to take it seriously critically, and not to cower in the face of its monopolistic character. Among those intellectuals anxious to reconcile themselves with the phenomenon and eager to find a common formula to express both their reservations against it and their respect for its power, a tone of ironic toleration prevails unless they have already created a new mythos of the 20th century from the imposed regression. After all, those culture industry reconsider T03 intellectuals maintain everyone knows what pocket novels, films off the rack, family television shows rolled out into serials and hit parades, advice to the lovelorn and horoscope columns are all about. All of this, however, is harmless and, according to them, even democratic since it responds to a demand, albeit a stimulated one. It also bestows all kinds of blessings, they point out, for example, through the dissemination of information, advice and stress-reducing patterns of behavior. Of course, as every sociological study measuring something as elementary as how politically informed the public is has proven, the information is meager or indifferent. Moreover, the advice to be gained from manifestations of the culture industry is vacuous, banal or worse, and the behavior patterns are shamelessly conformist. The two-faced irony in the relationship of servile intellectuals to the culture industry is not restricted to them alone. It may also be supposed that the consciousness of the consumers themselves is split between the prescribed fun which is supplied to them by the culture industry and a not particularly well hidden doubt about its blessings. The phrase, "the world wants to be deceived," has become truer than had ever been intended. People are not only, as the saying goes, falling for the swindle, if it guarantees them even the most fleeting gratification they desire a deception which is nonetheless transcendent transparent to them. They force their eyes shut and voice approval, in a kind of self-loathing, for what is meted out to them, knowing fully the purpose for which it is manufactured. Without admitting it, they sense that their lives would be completely intolerable as soon as they no longer clung to satisfactions which are none at all. The most ambitious defense of the culture industry today celebrates its spirit, which might be safely called ideology, as an ordering factor. In a supposedly chaotic world, it provides human beings with something like standards for orientation, and that alone seems worthy of approval. However, what its defenders imagine is preserved by the culture industry is in fact all the more thoroughly destroyed by it. The color film demolishes the genial old tavern to a greater extent than bombs ever could. The film exterminates its imago. No homeland can survive being processed by the films which celebrate it, and which thereby turn the unique character on which it thrives into an interchangeable sameness. T0 for the culture industry. That which legitimately could be called culture attempted, as an expression of suffering and contradiction, to maintain a grasp on the idea of the good life. Culture cannot represent either that which merely exists or the conventional and no longer binding categories of order which the culture industry drapes over the idea of the good life as if existing reality were the good life, and as if those categories were its true measure. If the response of the culture industry's representatives is that it does not deliver art at all, this is itself the ideology with which they evade responsibility for that from which the business lives. No misdeed is ever righted by explaining it as such. The appeal to order alone, without concrete specificity, is futile. The appeal to the dissemination of norms, without these ever proving themselves in reality or before consciousness, is equally futile. The idea of an objectively binding order, hucked to people because it is so lacking for them, has no claims if it does not prove itself internally and in confrontation with human beings. But this is precisely what no product of the culture industry would engage in. The concepts of order which it hammers into human beings are always those of the status quo. They remain unquestioned, unanalyzed and undialectically presupposed, even if they no longer have any substance for those who accept them. In contrast to the Kantian, the categorical imperative of the culture industry no longer has anything in common with freedom. It proclaims, you shall conform, without instruction as to what. Conform to that which exists anyway, and to that which everyone thinks anyway as a reflex of its power and omnipresence. The power of the culture industry's ideology is such that conformity has replaced consciousness. The order that springs from it is never confronted with what it claims to be or with the real interests of human beings. Order, however, is not good in itself. It would be so only as a good order. The fact that the culture industry is oblivious to this and extols order in abstracto, bears witness to the impotence and untruth of the messages it conveys. While it claims to lead the perplexed, it deludes them with false conflicts which they are to exchange for their own. It solves conflicts for them only in appearance, in a way that they can hardly be solved in their real lives. In the products of the culture industry, human beings get into trouble only so that they can be rescued unharmed, usually by representatives of a benevolent collective, and then in empty culture industry reconsider T05 harmony. They are reconciled with the general, whose demands they had experienced at the outset as irreconcilable with their interests. For this purpose, the culture industry has developed formulas which even reach into such non-conceptual areas as light musical entertainment. Here too one gets into a jam, into rhythmic problems, which can be instantly disentangled by the triumph of the basic beat. Even its defenders, however, would hardly contradict Plato openly, who maintained that what is objectively and intrinsically untrue cannot also be subjectively good and true for human beings. The concoctions of the culture industry are neither guides for a blissful life, nor a new art of moral responsibility, but rather exhortations to toe the line, behind which stand the most powerful interests. The consensus which it propagates strengthens blind, opaque authority. If the culture industry is measured not by its own substance and logic, but by its efficacy, by its position in reality and its explicit pretensions, if the focus of serious concern is with the efficacy to which it always appeals, the potential of its effect becomes twice as weighty. This potential, however, lies in the promotion and exploitation of the ego weakness to which the powerless members of contemporary society, with its concentration of power, are condemned. Their consciousness is further developed retrogressively. It is no coincidence that cynical American film producers are heard to say that their pictures must take into consideration the level of 11-year-olds. In doing so, they would very much like to make adults into 11-year-olds. It is true that thorough research has not, for the time being, produced an airtight case proving the regressive effects of particular products of the culture industry. No doubt an imaginatively designed experiment could achieve this more successfully than the powerful financial interests concerned would find comfortable. In any case, it can be assumed without hesitation that steady drops hollow the stone, especially since the system of the culture industry that surrounds the masses tolerates hardly any deviation and incessantly drills the same formulas on behavior. Only their deep unconsciousness truest, the last residue of the difference between art and empirical reality and the spirit UAL makeup of the masses explains why they have not, to a person, long since perceived and accepted the world as it is constructed for them by the culture industry. Even if its messages were as harmless as T06 the culture industry, they are made out to be. On countless occasions they are obviously not harmless, like the novies which chime in with currently popular hate campaigns against intellectuals by portraying them with the usual stereotypes. The attitudes which the culture industry calls forth are anything but harmless. If an astrologer urges his readers to drive carefully on a particular day, that certainly hurts no one. They will, however, be harmed indeed by the stupefaction which lies in the claim that advice which is valid every day and which is therefore idiotic, needs the approval of the stars. Human dependence and servitude, the vanishing point of the culture industry, could scarcely be more faithfully described than by the American interviewee who was of the opinion that the dilemmas of the contemporary epoch would end if people would simply follow the lead of prominent personalities. Insofar as the culture industry arouses a feeling of well-being at the world is precisely in that order suggested by the culture industry, the substitute gratification which it prepares for human beings cheats them out of the same happiness which it deceitfully projects. The total effect of the culture industry is one of anti-enlightenment, in which, as Horkheimer and I have noted, enlightenment, that is the progressive technical domination of nature, becomes mass deception and is turned into a means for fettering consciousness. It impedes the development of autonomous, independent individuals who judge and decide consciously for themselves. These, however, would be the precondition for a democratic society which needs adults who have come of age in order to sustain itself and develop. If the masses have been unjustly reviled from above as masses, The culture industry is not among the least responsible for making them into masses and then despising them, while obstructing the emancipation for which human beings are as ripe as the productive forces of the epoch permit. 4. Culture and administration. Whoever speaks of culture speaks of administration as well, whether this is his intention or not. The combination of so many things lacking a common denominator, such as philosophy and religion, science and art, forms of conduct and mores, and finally the inclusion of the objective spirit of an age in the single word culture betrays from the outset the administrative view, the task of which, looking down from on high, is to assemble, distribute, evaluate and organize. The word culture itself, in its specific use, is scarcely older than Kant, and its beloved adversary, civilization, did not establish itself at least in Germany until the 19th century. It was then elevated to the level of a slogan by Spengler. In any case, the present-day proximity of the concepts culture and administration is easily detected within the practices of language, which in radio broadcasting attach the title the cultural world encountered, insofar as it corresponds to a more or less precise idea of niveau and cultivation, in contrast to the sphere of entertainment, the province of administration, in other words, which is reserved for a spirit which is not spirit at all, but rather a service to listeners, devoted to light music along with its literary and dramatic pendants to a province where everything possible is. T08 The culture industry. At the same time, however, according to German concepts, Kultur is opposed to administration. Culture would like to be higher and more pure, something untouchable which cannot be tailored according to any tactical or technical considerations. In educated language, this line of thought makes reference to the autonomy of culture. Popular opinion even takes pleasure in associating the concept of personality with it. Culture is viewed as the manifestation of pure humanity without regard for its functional relationships within society. In spite of its self-righteous assonance, the word culture cannot be avoided. This proves to what a degree the category, correctly criticized hundreds of times, is both fitting for and dedicated to the world as it is, namely to the administrated world. Nonetheless, no halfway sensitive person can overcome the discomfort conditioned by his consciousness of a culture which is indeed administrated. As Edward Stuerman once formulated it, the more that is done for culture, the worse it fares. This paradox could be developed as follows. Culture suffers damage when it is planned and administrated. When it is left to itself, however, everything cultural threatens not only to lose its possibility of effect, but its very existence as well. It is neither possible to accept and critically the concept of culture, long permeated by ideas of departmentalization, nor to continue to shake one's head conservatively about what is being done to culture in the age of integral organization. The aversion towards the words culture and administration, an aversion by no means free of barbarism and overshadowed by the urge to release the safety catch on a revolver, must not conceal that a certain truth is involved in it. This makes possible the treatment of culture as something of a unity, as for example the heads of cultural departments of cities are wont to do when they unite in the hands of an expert a series of objects which for the moment actually do have something in common. This common factor stands in contrast to everything which serves the reproduction of material life, the literal self-preservation of the human being in general, and the needs of his mere existence. Everyone knows that these boundaries cannot be clearly fixed. From the beginning it has been argued whether the spheres of justice and politics are to be included in culture. They are, at any rate, not to be found in the cultural departments organized by administration. It is further difficult to deny that due to the total tendencies at work in the culture and administration T09 present, many facets traditionally allotted to culture come to resemble material production more and more. The natural sciences far into the highest reaches of theoretical discipline, philosophic according to older ways of thinking, in a manner hardly expected from the traditional perspective of culture, determined to an ever greater degree the down to earth fate of man. The progress of these sciences is, in turn, directly dependent upon the forces of material life, that is, of economics. This is the situation before which man stands today and which is so discomforting to him. The point is missed, however, if this situation is merely discussed to death by concentrating upon supposedly transitional phenomena. The current inclination to deny embarrassing contradictions in this matter by means of conceptual distinctions and manipulations, a type of vulgarized epistemology, must be resisted. For the moment the simple fact must be recognized that that which is specifically cultural is that which is removed from the naked necessity of life. This, however, does not offer dispensation from the consideration of the meaning of administration. For this is no longer merely a national or communal institution existing in clear separation from the free play of social forces. The tendency of every institution towards expansion both quantitatively and qualitatively was designated as immanent by Max Weber in the Theory of Social and Economic Organization, Part 2, Chapter 6. Weber did this in keeping with the formally definitional method of his late work. In Weber's view, bureaucracies, following their own law, are destined to expand. In the recent past the Nazi SS offers the most horrid example of this thesis. Weber finds the foundation for his thesis in the technical superiority of the organizational type of administration in contrast to traditionalist organization. The decisive reason for the advance of bureaucratic organization has always been its purely technical superiority over every other form of organization. A fully developed bureaucratic mechanism stands in the same relationship to other forms as does a machine to the non-mechanical production of goods. Precision, speed, clarity, documentary ability, continuity, discretion, unity, rigid subordination, reduction of friction and of material and personal expenses are unique to bureaucratic organization. In the case of monocratic administration, these factors are intensified to the optimum through schooled individual officials in TT0 the culture industry, contrast to colleague-like older forms which are either honorary or extra-official. Page 600F. It is precisely the example of the S's, however, which shows to what degree the formal concept of rationality, imputed by Weber and restricted to an ends-means relationship, impedes judgment on the rationality of means. In Weber's own theory of rationality, there is a suspicion of the imprint of administrated thought. The mechanism through which independence is established by organizations would have to be defined more specifically than was done by Weber or even in the formal sociology of Simmel, who simply contrasted phenomena of social ossification with life as a metaphysical actuality. Organizations of convenience in an antagonistic society must necessarily pursue particular ends. They do this at the expense of the interests of other groups. Therefore, obduracy and reification necessarily result. If such organizations continue to occupy a subordinate position within which they were totally open and honest towards their membership and its direct desires, they would be incapable of any action. The more firmly integrated they are, the greater is their prospect for asserting themselves in relation to others. The advantage of totalitarian monolithic nations over liberalist nations in power politics, which can be internationally observed today, is also applicable to the structure of organizations of small format. Their external effectivity is a function of their inner homogeneity, which in turn is dependent upon the so-called totality gaining primacy over individual interests, so that the organization qua organization takes the place of such interests. An organization is forced into independence by self-preservation. At the same time, this establishment of independence leads to alienation from its purposes and from the people of whom it is composed. Finally, in order to be able to pursue its goals appropriately, it enters into a contradiction with them. It is difficult to accept the imminent tendency of administration towards expansion and the establishment of independence as a simple form of control as the explanation for the transition from administrative apparatuses in the older sense of the word into those of the administrated world, along with their entry into regions not previously subject to administration. Responsibility for this might lie in the extant sign of conditions of exchange throughout the entirety of life in the face of increasing monopolization. Thinking in equivalence is in itself a culture and administration 111 form of production insofar as it produces the commensurability of all objects along with their subsumability under abstract rules. Qualitative differences between spheres as well as those within each individual sphere are reduced and therewith the resistance against administration is lessened. At the same time, growing concentration brings about units of such scope that traditionalist, in any way irrational methods, are no longer of any help. Economically, risk increases along with the size of the unit and this calls for planning, at least planning of the type demanded up to now by the type in control, defined by Max Weber as the monocratic type. However, the immoderate size even of those institutions not concerned about profit such as education and radio furthers the practices of administration through the demand for organizational gradation. These practices are strengthened by technological development. In the case of radio, for example, that which is to be communicated is concentrated to the extreme and disseminated as far as possible. Max Weber was still in a position to restrict his thought essentially to administration in the narrow sense, that is, to bureaucratic hierarchies. He made note, in agreement with Robert Michels, of analogous tendencies only in political parties and, of course, in the sector of education and instruction as well. Meanwhile, this tendency has left all this far behind and achieved total development. This it has done by no means only in economic monopolies. The increase in the quantity of administrative apparatus has brought about a new quality. Mechanisms conceived according to a liberalistic model are no longer roofed over or interpenetrated by administration. They have rather assumed the upper hand towards spheres of freedom to such a degree that the latter appear only to be tolerated. Precisely this was anticipated in the era of pre-fascism by Karl Mannheim. Even culture is not taboo to this tendency. Within the economic sector, Weber asks whether the understanding of the administrators for the objective problems which they have to solve is equal to the powers which they wield. This is so because precise factual knowledge in their field is a matter of immediate economic existence. Errors in official statistics bring no direct consequences for the guilty official. Errors in the calculation of a capitalistic concern result in losses to the FRM. Indeed, perhaps even in the loss of its existence. However, the question regarding the competence of bureaucracies, formulated by T2 the culture industry, Weber in regard to economics, has in the meantime magnified in scope to the same degree as has administration itself within society. This question becomes critical in the cultural sphere. Weber touches upon what is coming in a parenthetical remark without realizing the significance of his observation, made over 40 years ago during the conception of his great work. Within the highly specialized context of the educational sociological annotation to this chapter on bureaucracy, he mentions that the possession of educational patents increasingly represses talent or charisma, for the spiritual cost of educational patents is always slight and does not particularly decrease with mass production. According to this thought, that a rational mission which is not to be planned progressively withdraws from the spirit itself, while this remains a mission for which the spirit is uniquely suited according to traditional views. In an excourse, Weber underscores this view. Behind all pronouncements of the present day on the basis of education is to be found at some decisive point that struggle of the specialist type against old cultured humanity, a struggle which penetrated into all the most intimate questions of culture and which is conditioned by the irrevocable expansion of the control of all public and private relations through bureaucratization and the steadily increasing significance of specialized knowledge. Weber's opposition to specialized humanity expressed here is of the type common in late liberal society since Ibsen's Hedda Gabler. Inseparable from this, however, is the obligatory increase of administrative control in regions in which administration is without objective competence. Specialists must exercise authority in fields in which they cannot be professionally qualified, while their particular aptitude in abstractly technical matters of administration is needed in order that the organization continues to function. The dialectic of culture and administration nowhere expresses the sacrosanct irrationality of culture so clearly as in the continually growing alienation of administration from culture, both in terms of its subjective categories and its personal composition. And culture, of course, seems most thoroughly irrational to those who have had the smallest experience of it, for that which is administrated, administration is an external affair by which it is subsumed rather than comprehended. This is precisely the essence of administrated rationality itself. Culture and administration 13, which does nothing but order and cover over. In the chapter on amphiboly and the critique of pure reason, Kant, in opposition to Leibniz, denied rationality the ability of cognition of the interior of things. Aparia prevails between the absolute purpose of the cultural and the absolute rationality of administration, which is nothing but the rationality of scientific ratio. What is called cultural with good reason must recollectively assimilate whatever has been left along the way in the process of the progressive control of nature, reflected in increasing rationality and ever more rational forms of control. Culture is the perennial claim of the particular over the general, as long as the latter remains unreconciled to the former. At least, this was envisioned in the distinction between the nomothetic and the ideographic. Problematic as this distinction might be, made in the Southwest German school towards which Max Weber was philosophically inclined. However, administration necessarily represents without subjective guilt guilt and without individual will. The general against this particular, the twisted feeling of irreconcilability in the relation of culture and administration is characteristic of this situation. It bears witness to the continuing antagonistic character of a world which is growing ever more unified. The demand made by administration upon culture is essentially heteronomous. Culture by norms not inherent to it and which have nothing to do with the quality of the object, but rather with some type of abstract standards imposed from without, while at the same time the administrative instance according to its own prescriptions and nature, does for the most part refuse to become involved in questions of immanent quality which regard the truth of the thing itself or its objective basis in general. Such expansion of administrative competence into a region, the idea of which contradicts every kind of average generality inherent to the concept of administrative norms, is itself irrational, alien to the immanent ratio of the object, for example, to the quality of a work of art and a matter of coincidence as far as culture is concerned. The self-consciousness of this antinomy and the consequences thereof are the first demands which would have to be made upon an administrative praxis which is mature and enlightened in the Kantian sense no matter what form it takes, is to be measured at an early point beginning around the middle of the 19th century. Culture began to resist this rationality of purpose. During for the culture industry, age of symbolism and art nouveau, artists such as Oscar Wilde Provoker, tidily called culture useless. In bourgeois society, however, a terribly complex relation prevails between the useful and the useless, a situation which is by no means new today. The usefulness of the useful is itself by no means beyond doubt and the useless occupies the place of that which can no longer be distorted by profit. Much which is classified as useful goods goes beyond the directly biological reproduction of life. This reproduction itself is in no sense a great beyond of history, but rather is dependent upon that which is looked upon as culture. If human beings of the industrial era were to spend the days of their existence under those conditions which characterize the vegetative life of the Stone Age, they would no doubt perish. Critical theory, in its view of society, has expressed this in the hypothesis that reproduction of the labor force corresponds to the cultural state historically achieved by any given age. This is not necessarily a static natural category. It is not necessary to be a follower of the American economist Veblen, back to whom technocracy dates and who tendentiously viewed all goods not drastically necessary as the expression of control, status and ostentation. He further designated all of culture as that looked upon in the slovenly jargon of the administrated world as show. It is not possible, however, to be blind to the fact that the useful, that which is of advantage to man in all previous history, is nothing immediate, existing for its own sake, but rather that within the total system which has its eye directed towards profit, the useful per se has been relegated to a secondary position, where it is produced by the machinery of the system as well. There is hardly another point to which the consciousness of society is so allergic as it is to this one. Precisely because the usefulness of the useful is so dubious a matter, it is doubly important that this apparatus demonstrate its usefulness through its function solely for the sake of the consumer. For this reason the line of demarcation between the useful and the useless is drawn so strictly in ideology, the enthronement of culture as an entity unto itself, independent of all material conditions, indeed, as something which makes these conditions matters of total indifference, is a fitting correlation of the faith in the pure usefulness of the useful. Culture is looked upon as thoroughly useless and for that reason as something beyond the planning and administrative methods of material, culture and administration. 5. Production. This results in a much sharper definition of the profile upon which the claim to validity of both the useful and the useless is based. See, one factor of actuality has manifested itself within this ideology, the separation of culture from the material processes of life, and finally, the social hiatus between physical and intellectual work. The heritage of this situation is to be observed in the antinomy of culture and administration. The sense of philistinism which clings to administration is of the same type, and not only philologically, as the odium attached to low, useful, and, in the final analysis, physical labor by antiquity. The rigid opposition of culture and administration in thought, the product of a social and spiritual situation which attempts at the same time to force the two together, has nonetheless always been a questionable matter. In art history it is well known that wherever the artifacts of the past manifest the demand for collective labor, and this extends deep into the individual production of significant architects, sculptors and painters, administration spoke with a decisive voice. For that reason even in the past administration by no means lived in happy harmony with those who today unhesitatingly call themselves the creators of culture, a romantic desire fondly projected backward into history. The church and later the regents of the Italian city-states, followed by the princes of absolutism, represented administrative instances from the perspective of their relation to the sphere of culture. Their relation to cultural production was probably far more substantial than that between present-day administration and administrated culture. The undisputed dominance of religion reduced the contrast between culture and practical life. The powerful lords of that day, often enough, to be sure, condottieri, were probably closer to culture than many of the administrative specialists of a society marked by the radical division of labor. This, however, made their control of culture all the more immediate and rigorous, for it was unchecked by any regulations or rational rules of procedure. The relation of the immanent truth of cultural configurations to that which has today been given the dubious name of commission was at that time, at any rate, hardly less odious than today. Great artists even of a type which seems by and large to have agreed with the objectively valid spirit of their time, such as Bach, lived in permanent conflict with their administrations. Less is known about such conflicts during the High Middle. T6 The culture industry, ages only because at that time they were predecided in favor of the administrative power simply as a matter of principle. In relation to this power, demands which have achieved full consciousness of themselves only in the modern concept of individualism scarcely had a chance. Despite all this there has been an essential change in the relation between culture and organized power. Culture, as that which goes involves an irrevocably critical impulse towards the status quo and all institutions thereof. This is by no means merely a tendency embodied in many cultural structures, but rather a protest against integration which always violently opposes that which is qualitatively different. In a certain sense this criticism is directed against the idea of leveling unification itself. The fact that anything at all thrives which is different and which is not to be turned into cash illuminates the prevailing praxis in all its dubiousness. It is not only through its manifest practical intentions, but rather through its mere existence, indeed, precisely through that art manifests a polemic, secretly practical character. This, however, cannot be reconciled through the insertion of culture as a category cultural activities into the totality of prevailing practices has been done under current conditions with total smoothness. At one time the line of demarcation between reality and culture was neither so sharp nor so deep as it now is. Works of art did not, for example, reflect upon their own autonomy and upon the formal law unique to each of them. Rather they had their place within given contexts, within which they fulfilled a function, no matter how immediate it was. They did not yet assert their existence as works of art to the degree which was later to seem almost a matter of course. It was precisely this factor from which the fullness and comprehensiveness of their success, indeed their very artistic power, benefited. Paul Valéry enlarged upon this topic without falling victim to the balsam-like cliché regarding the human being for whom all things supposedly exist. The human being has become fashionable only since he became fungible. If one reads Vasari's biographies of the painters, one is astonished to note the stress which he places upon the ability of the painters of the Renaissance to imitate nature, that is, to create portraits of great similarity to their models, as something particularly worthy of praise. Since the invention of photography, this ability, not easily separated beyond the system of self-preservation of the species its impractical nature, culture and administration 117, from practical purposes in painting, has become a matter of increasing indifference, an attitude which extends to older painting as well. But even Valéry suspected that such painting owed its aesthetic authenticity to the fact that it had not yet taken an oath to a chemically pure concept of the aesthetic, implying that, in the final analysis, art might exist as art only where it no longer expressed any ambition as art. This attitude involved the full awareness on the part of art that its previous innocence was not to be re-established through an imagined communal will. At any rate, the concept of culture has been neutralized to a great extent through its emancipation from the actual processes of life experienced with the rise of the bourgeoisie and the Enlightenment. The opposition of culture to the status quo has been deadened to a large degree. Hegel's latent resign theory, which reserves the concept of absolute spirit, in contrast to his views in the phenomenology, only for cultural spheres in the narrower sense, is the first and up until now still the most significant theoretical imprint of this state of affairs. The process of neutralization, the transformation of culture into something independent and external, removed from any possible relation to praxis, makes it possible to integrate it into the organization from which it untiringly cleanses itself. Furthermore, this is accomplished neither with contradiction nor with danger. Today manifestations of extreme artistry can be fostered, produced and presented by official institutions. Indeed, art is dependent upon such support if it is to be produced at all and find its way to an audience. Yet, at the same time, art denounces everything institutional and official. This gives some evidence of the neutralization of culture and of the irreconcilability with administration of that which has been neutralized. Through the sacrifice of its possible relation to praxis, the cultural concept itself becomes an instance of organization. That which is so provokingly useless in culture is transformed into tolerated negativity, or even into something negatively useful, into a lubricant for the system, into something which exists for something else, into untruth, or into goods of the culture industry calculated for the consumer. All this is registered today in the uncomfortable relation between culture and administration. Nothing escapes the attention of radically socialized society, which, TIA the culture industry, further affects the culture of which it seizes control. This can be illustrated in simple fashion. Some time ago a small publication appeared, a pamphlet, apparently written for the needs of those who undertake cultural trips through Europe of whatever use such a brochure could possibly be. It offered a concise catalogue of artistic festivals during this particular summer and the autumn as well. The reason for such a scheme is obvious. It permits the cultural traveler to divide his time and to seek out that which he thinks will be of interest to him. In short, he can plan his trip according to the same principle which lies behind the organization of these festivals. They are all embraced and controlled by a single comprehensive organization. Inherent in the idea of the festival, however, and of the artistic festival as well, no matter how secularized and weakened it might be, is a claim to something unique, to the emphatic event which is not fungible. Festivals are to be celebrated as they come. They are not to be organized only from the perspective of avoiding overlapping. Administrative reason which takes control of them and rationalizes them banishes festivity from them. This results in an intensification into the grotesque which cannot escape the notice of the more sensitive nerves present at these so-called cultural offerings, even at those of the avant-garde. In an effort to preserve a feeling of contrast to contemporary streamlining, culture is still permitted to drive about in a type of gypsy wagon. The gypsy wagons, however, roll about secretly in a monstrous hall, a fact which they do not themselves notice. This might well explain to no small degree the loss of inattention, which is to be observed today at various points even in progressive cultural productions, to say nothing of the less progressive efforts. Whatever raises from within itself a claim to being autonomous, critical and antithetical while at the same time never being able to assert this claim with total legitimacy, must necessarily come to naught. This is particularly true when its impulses are integrated into something heteronymous to them, which has been worked out previously from above, that is to say, when it is granted the space in which to draw breath immediately by that power against which it rebels. At the same time, this is not a result of the easily criticized excesses of managerism gone wild. In the administrated world, managers are used as scapegoats almost as frequently as the bureaucrats. The assignment of objective, culture and administration T9, guilt relationships to people is itself a product of prevailing ideology. Paradoxical developments are unavoidable. The total social and economic tendency consumes the material basis of traditional culture, either liberal or individualistic in style. The appeal to the creators of culture to withdraw from the process of administration and keep distant from it has a hollow ring. Not only will this deprive them of the possibility of earning a living, but also of every effect, every contact between work of art and society, something which the work of greatest integrity cannot do without, if it is not to perish. Those who praise the pity of their withdrawal from organization, those quiet voices in the nation arouse the suspicion that they are provincial and petit bourgeois reactionaries. The popular argument that the material basis for the productive spirit, and this always has meant the non-conforming spirit, has always been precarious and that this spirit has preserved its power in defiant self-assertion is threadbare. The fact that an undesirable condition is nothing which is set in just today is no reason for perpetuating it if this condition is no longer necessary. That better things will make their way by by virtue of their own power is nothing but an edifying gingerbread slogan. Much is lost in the night. From time to time coincidental discoveries, such as that of Georg Buchner by Carl Emil Francis, give an idea of the senseless destruction which has taken place in the history of mankind, even in the sphere of spiritual production. Furthermore, there has been a qualitative change in this region. There no longer are any hiding places, not even in Europe, which in this respect, as in so many others, involuntarily imitates America. There is no longer dignity in poverty, not even any longer the possibility of modestly surviving the winter for a person who loses his position in the administrated world. It is sufficient to call to mind an existence such as that of Paul Verlaine at the end of the 19th century, the lift of the fallen alcoholic who, even when he was down and out, found friendly and understanding doctors in Paris hospitals who supported him in the midst of the most extreme of situations. Anything similar would be unthinkable today. Not that there is any lack of such doctors or of friendly people in general. In a certain sense, the administrated world has witnessed in many areas an increase in humanitarianism from the perspective of concern on the part of everyone for everyone. It is just that such doctors, with an eye towards T20 the culture industry, their administrations, would probably no longer have the right to give shelter to the vagabond genius, to honor him and to protect him from humiliation. Instead, he would become the object of public welfare, attended and fed and treated with great care, to be sure, but torn from his way of life and therewith presumably from the possibility of expressing that which he had once felt to be the purpose of his life in the world. No matter how dubious the attitude towards the product, honor the definitely degraded and rejected Verlaine was. The concept of socially useful work cannot be separated from the process of integral socialization. It would necessarily also be held up to the person whose usefulness can be defined only in terms of the negation of this process, and salvation would hardly turn out to be a blessing to the man saved. Today, to become aware of such situations, it is by no means necessary to concentrate upon that customarily defined following the Second War by the fatally neutralizing word border situation, Gren situation, although it is clear that such situations, extreme situations, are in themselves inseparable from the substantiality of everything cultural down to the present day. In this region the concept of the average has no place. The changes in the basic social stratum of culture, which is the matter of central concern here, extend into more harmless regions. In Vienna of the 1920s within the Schoenberg circle the strength of tradition among the anti-traditionalists, both in terms of art and of general personal conduct, was surprising. The spirit which attracted people to this circle was decidedly artistic, selective and sensitive. It bore within itself the markings of discriminatory competence and a sense of history. These artists, prepared for the dissolution of established ideas and norms, existed with a certain naivete and matter-of-factness within Austrian society, which remained half-closed and half-feudal even after the fall of the monarchy. It is precisely to this society that they owe that sensuous culture and impatient subtlety which brought them into conflict with Viennese conformism. The boldness of artistic renewal joined hands with proud negligence. In spite of all irony and skepticism, numerous categories of a still firmly integrated social and spiritual order were accepted. These categories provided a not inconsiderable prerequisite for the insubordinate tenderness of this generation. It was necessary, as it were, to be satiated with tradition in one culture and administration, order really to be able to negate it and to be able to turn the unique vital force of tradition against ossification and self-satisfaction. It is only where that which was is still strong enough to form the forces within the subject and at the same time to oppose them that the production of that which has not yet been seems possible. Constructivism and greenhouses can be conceived only under conditions of warmth and within psychologically protected dwellings, and this is not to be understood only in literal terms. However, the equalization of the tensions felt today between culture and its subjective conditions threatens culture with spiritual death by freezing. In its relation to reality there is a dialectic of non-simultaneity, only where the development towards the administrated world and social modernity had not yet asserted itself so successfully. In France and Austria, for example, did the aesthetically modern, the avant-garde, thrive, when reality, however, dwells upon the current standard. A tendentious leveling of consciousness takes place. The more easily consciousness adjusts to integral reality, the more it is discouraged from going beyond that which is there once and for all. Naturally, by no means all cultural spheres are subject to this dialectic of non-simultaneity. Many of them are actually in need of the newest administrative standards. This is true of the whole community of natural sciences, which probably both absorb and also produce the strongest productive forces today. They could not do justice to their present-day assignments in any other way than through the aid in planning offered by administration. The rationality of the sciences is itself similar to that of administration. The same situation exists wherever teamwork, collective effort, and wide-range investigation are necessary, such as in empirical social research. This field has not only modeled its own training after the example of administrative category, yes, without administration, it would sink into chaos, above all, into that which is coincidentally particular and irresponsible. Even art could not possibly oppose all this en bloc. A field such as architecture, which, by virtue of its foundation and practical needs, is today better off than the autonomous artistic genres, was never conceivable without administration. The film, above all, because of the scope of costs which can be made only through investment, is dependent upon a type of planning analogous to that of public administration. In the film, to be T22 the culture industry, sure, the contradiction between inescapably calculating and the truth of matters is defined with horrifying clarity. The foolishness of the film is not so much the product of individual failure as of this contradiction. Its principle is the planning intention which includes the cinemagoer in its calculation. This results in lack of harmony. Administration, however, is not simply imposed upon the supposedly productive human being from without. It multiplies within this person himself. That a particular situation in time brings forth those subjects intended for it is to be taken very literally. Nor are those who produce culture secure before the increasingly organic composition of mankind. Cf. Adorno, Minima Moralia, page 442, section 147. Their security terminates in the situation before then in opposition to spontaneity in much the same way in which it manifests itself within material production. Whoever possesses a flair for such tendencies can expect to encounter disguised administrative categories even in the most advanced avant-garde artistic products. Indeed, even in the most finely nuanced emotions of the individual, in his voice and gestures, attention must be directed toward aesthetic tendencies in the direction of integral construction. This can be verified at many junctures. Such tendencies envision a type of planning from above, the analogy of which to administration is not to be ignored. Such structures might well be totally predetermined. According to Max Weber's thesis, administration, by its very nature, by and large excludes individual arbitrariness in favor of an objectively regulated process. In the same manner, the individual action of the idea in art of this type is frowned upon. At the same time, the applied methods of procedures are not arbitrarily thought out, and this is what gives the phenomenon its weight, but rather developed with an eminently artistic consequence. These methods can be traced back very far into history, cf. Adorno, Clanague on page 95. But it is precisely art which gives voice to the seemingly individual and coincidental which is now to be the subject of total aesthetic prohibition, and which in turn must pay the price for progressive integration, presenting a totally different situation than that found in actual administration. Within certain boundaries, administration through rational ordering processes actually prevents negative coincidence, blind control over others, nepotism and favoritism. Ever since Aristotle's Politics, it has been well known that the shadow of culture and administration 123 injustice falls upon the just rational law within the order of reality, so that the rationality of administrative acts stands in need of that corrective which Aristotle included as equity. The work of art is limited by this residue to the same degree. To the work of art clings an impulse of that which is ordered and produced from without, secretly of that subjectivism which is indeed anathema. Today the field of tension within all advanced art is actually defined by the poles of radical construction and equally radical resistance against it. Often both factors merge. Furthermore, it is from this perspective that Taoism is to be understood. The negation of the concept of the cultural is itself under preparation. The major factor therein is the dismissal of such concepts as autonomy, spontaneity and criticism. Autonomy, because the subject, rather than making conscious decisions, both has and wishes to subjugate itself to whatever has been preordained. The reason for this is that the spirit, which according to traditional cultural concepts should be its own lawgiver, at every instant now experiences its own impotence in relation to the overwhelming demands of mere being. Spontaneity diminishes because total planning takes precedence over the individual impulse, predetermining this impulse in turn, reducing it to the level of illusion, and no longer tolerating that play of forces which was expected to give rise to a free totality. And finally, criticism is dying out because the critical spirit is as disturbing as sand in a machine to that smoothly running operation which is becoming more and more the model of the cultural. This critical spirit now seems antiquated, irresponsible and unworthy, much like armchair thinking. The relationship between generations has been reversed ludicrously. Youth seeks its validation in the principle of reality while the older generation digresses into the intelligible world. The National Socialists, who anticipated all this in brutal fashion, thereby unmasking it paradoxically, were in relation to the category of the critical precisely the heralds of a coming development. This was manifested in their replacement of criticism with their own observations upon art, which in actuality offered only information on factual matters. This same tendency is to be noted in the increasing suppression of the critical spirit today. A journal of the avant-garde proudly displays the subtitle information. In many sectors the accounts have not yet been balanced. This is 24 the culture industry, particularly true of those regions isolated or distant from the most powerful social tendencies, although they hardly benefit from their isolation. In official culture, on the other hand, the accounts balance all the more perfectly. UNESCO poets actually come into being who are, for example, capable of enthusiasm because their humane blossoms in the midst of inhuman situations. In the wake of a humanitarianism which steers clear of any controversial issue, they inscribe the international slogans of high administration with their very heart's blood. Nothing need be said about the infantile trash to which the authorities of government and party obligate artists. No one would be astonished if in the West projects were financed involving research on generally valid, absolute values, conducted, however, with the underdeveloped countries in the back of the mind. There is no lack of obliging intellectuals ready to cast suspicions upon the critical spirit of true intellectuals through an affirmation of life borrowed from one-dad marriage offers. This official picture of humanism is completed by accusing everything truly human and in no way official of inhumanity. For criticism takes from man his meager spiritual possessions, removing the veil which he himself looks upon as benevolent. The anger aroused in him by the unveiled image is diverted to those who tear this veil, in keeping with the hypothesis of Helvetius that truth never damages anyone except him who utters it. My by no means new observation that even that which deviates is by no means secure from standardization has recently been used to discredit the polemic application of the concept of conformism, as if the fact that there is a second-rate conformism, preceded at least by an act of resistance, somehow makes more palatable that first spineless conformism, that swimming along with the current and simultaneous adjustments to stronger battalions. In truth, to borrow a word from Heinrich Regius, one attacks the word conformism because one is in total agreement with the process defined by it. A further particularly clear phenomenon to which the label of the muses is attached has its place in administrated culture. This is the attempt, effective in terms of mass psychology, to save the spontaneity which is threatened by administrational, as they refer to it in those circles. Through correct understanding, every attempt of pedagogy to lay claim to the spiritual is an expression of this desire. The visible, cultry and administration T25. Result is regression, blind complacency on the part of the subject, encouraged to be spontaneous. It is no accident that the jargon of authenticity is spoken everywhere in these spheres, the language of which Karl Lorne has offered such penetrant examples in his recent book on language in the administrated word. Particularly outstanding in this regard is the chapter on pretense. This jargon is not identical with the administrative language of older vintage, as it can be encountered still today in old filing cabinets haunted by the tone of its touchingly subaltern notes. The old administrative language, dust-covered and antiquated, bears significant witness to the relative separation of administration and culture, whereby against its will, it pays homage to culture. The jargon of authenticity, however, united the heterogeneous under one roof, linguistic components from an individual sphere, from theological tradition, existential philosophy, the youth movement, the military or from expressionism, are institutionally absorbed and then, to a certain extent, returned to the private sphere, placed back in the possession of the individual person, who can then speak with ease, freedom and joy about mission and encounter, about authentic renouncement and concern, as though he himself were pleased. In truth, he is only putting on airs, as though each individual were his own announcer on FM radio. If, for example, a letter contains the phrase in approximately, the reader can assume that a few lines later the writer of the letter will announce his intention of approaching the person addressed in the near future. The personal contact stipulated in this way is nothing but the mask of an administrative process which draws the person thus addressed into its function. Humanity which can be turned on and off should inspire the person addressed to unpaid achievements. Nonetheless, what is demonstrated by such models is to be attributed to administration, in regard to which one might console oneself by means of a philosophically disreputable concept of inwardness or with pure culture which is guaranteed genuine. Those who use such words are the first to attack everything unregimented in a rage. In truth, culture itself is expected to pay the bill. Even when culture is viewed as something removed from reality, it is in no way isolated from reality, but rather involved instructions for actual realization, no matter how distant and mediated this might be. If culture is totally deprived of this, T26 the culture industry, impulse, it becomes invalid. Within culture administration only repeats the offenses committed by culture itself in that it ever degraded itself to an element of representation, to a field of activity, and, finally, to a sector of mass action, of propaganda and of tourism. If culture is defined as the debarbarization of man, elevating him beyond the state of simple nature, without actually perpetuating this state through violent suppression, then culture is a total failure. It has not been able to take root in man as long as he has lacked the prerequisites for an existence marked by human dignity. It is no coincidence that he is still capable of barbarous outbursts because of suppressed rancor about his fate, about his deeply felt lack of freedom. The fact that he welcomes the trash of the culture industry with outstretched arms, half aware that it is trash, is another aspect of the same state of affairs, the seeming harmlessness of which is probably restricted to the surface. Culture long ago evolved into his own contradiction, the congealed content of educational privilege. For that reason it now takes its place within the material production process as an administrative supplement to it. Furthermore, whoever resisted being convinced that it is necessary to bring on something ominously positive immediately is not going to be content to step aside shaking his head once he has taken stock of all these difficulties, simply because the objective possibility of anything better is blocked. The radicalism which promises itself everything by virtue of total change is abstract, for even within the change totality the problems of the individual obstinately return again. Such radicalism loses ground as soon as its idea volatilizes into a chimera, dispensing every further effort toward improvement. Within itself, it then becomes an agent to sabotage something better. Excessive demand is a sublime form of sabotage. On the other hand, it is not to be overlooked that in the question regarding what is to be done here and now, a type of total social subject is imagined. A community of hommes de bonne volonté who need only take their places around a gigantic round table in order to bring order into this chaos of failure. But the difficulties of the cultural, for which the commonplace concept of crisis is no longer in any way sufficient, are so deeply rooted that individual goodwill is severely restricted. There is no point in imagining a unanimous will where objective and subjective antagonism provokes disaster. Finally, culture and administration. The threat experienced by the spirit and the fact of rationalization is an indication that the irrationality of the entire situation continues unchanged and that every particular rationalization benefits this irrationality and that it strengthens the pressures of a blind and unreconciled generality upon the particular. The antinomy of planning and culture result in the dialectical idea of absorbing that which is spontaneous and not planned into planning, of creative space for these factors and of a strengthening of their possibilities. This idea does not dispense with the basis of social justice, the possibility of decentralization, particularly in view of the state of the forces of technical production as they now approach utopian diamond science, is favorable to it. Planning of the non-planned within a specific sector, that of education, was emphatically advocated by Helmut Becker. There are other fields which offer analogous situations. In spite of this seeming plausibility, however, the feeling of untruth cannot be overcome totally, namely, the feeling that the non-planned is degraded to a costume of itself and, consequently, that the freedom involved becomes a fiction. One need only compare the synthetic artists' quarter of New York, Greenwich Village, with the Parisian Rive Gauche of pre-Hitler days. In the New York district, license continues to exist as an officially tolerated institution. For this reason it has become what the Americans call phony. Furthermore, in the tendency to reserve for artists a particular lifestyle, a tendency which dominated the entire 19th century, and to permit them to give form to that which is repulsive to the bourgeois society from which they live, has concealed the deception exploited perhaps for the first time by Murger's Bohème novel. Planning of the non-planned would have to establish at the outset the degree to which it is compatible with the specific content of the non-planned, that is, to what degree planning from this perspective is rational. Beyond this lies the question regarding the impersonal one, the person, that is, who represents the instance which makes decisions on the greatest difficulties. In the beginning nothing more can be demanded than a cultural policy, thought out within itself and aware of these difficulties, a policy which does not conceive of the concept of culture as a reified fixed configuration of values, but rather a policy which absorbs critical considerations in order to develop them. 127. T28 The culture industry. Further, such a cultural policy would not misunderstand itself as God-willed, it would not blindly endorse faith in culture, blind to its entanglement with the social totality, and for that very reason truly entangled. It would find a parallel in the negative naivete involved in accepting administration as faith, that is, whoever receives an office from God, receives ratio from him as well. Administration which wishes to do its part must renounce itself. It needs the ignominious figure of the expert. No city administration, for example, can decide from which painter it should buy paintings, unless it can rely on people who have a serious, objective and progressive understanding of painting. In establishing the necessity of the expert, one immediately exposes himself again to every imaginable reproach, to the notorious accusation, for example, that the judgment of an expert remains a judgment for experts and as such ignores the community from which, according to popular phraseology, public institutions receive their mandate, or that the expert, necessarily an administrator himself, makes his decision from on high, thus extinguishing spontaneity. Furthermore, his authority is not always secure and, among other things, it is a difficult matter to distinguish him from the apparatchik. Although one might be willing to concede the correctness of some of the aspects mentioned here, distrust toward the argument of the man on the street that culture does after all have something to contribute to the life of man will remain. The state of consciousness according to which one is to orient himself from the perspective of this argumentation is in truth the very state of consciousness which would have to be overcome by any culture sufficient to its own concept. All too much pleasure is found in attacks upon exposed modern art, coupled with attacks against administrations which supposedly wasted the pennies of the taxpayer on experiments which the latter viewed either with indifference or rejection. This argumentation is of an illusory democracy. An offshoot of that totalitarian technique tries to gain life through the exploitation of plebiscite forms of democracy. What such voices of the popular soul hate most is anything of free spirit. They sympathize with stale reaction. While the total social constitution formally guarantees equal rights, it nonetheless continues to conserve the educational privilege, granting the possibility of differentiated and progressive spiritual experience to only a few. The Culture and Administration T29 platitude the progress of spiritual things, particularly of art, proceeds in the beginning against the will of the majority, makes it possible for the mortal enemies of all progress to entrench themselves behind those who, without any guilt of their own, to be sure, are excluded from the vital expression of their own concern. A cultural policy which has rid itself of social naivete must see through this complex without fear of the mass of majorities. Through cultural policy alone it is hardly possible to eradicate the contradiction between democratic order and the actual consciousness of those who are kept in a continuing state of minority by social conditions. But democracy through representation, to which even the experts in the administration of cultural matters owe their legitimation, nonetheless permits a certain balance. It makes possible the hindrance of maneuvers which serve barbarism through the corruption of the idea of objective quality by means of callous appeal to the common will. Walter Benjamin's thought on critics whose task it is to uphold the interest of the public against the public itself can be applied to cultural policy as well. To serve this purpose is the duty of the expert. The longing for individuals who might work beyond the realm of expertise usually characterizes only regression or the desire for technicians of communication, with whom, simply because they are lacking any real understanding of matters, one can get along better and who dwell all the more conformingly within their own policy. There is no pure immediacy of culture. Wherever it permits itself to be consumed arbitrarily by a public as consumer goods, it manipulates people. The subject becomes the subject of culture only through the mediation of objective discipline. The advocate thereof, in the administrated world, at any rate, is the expert. To be sure, it might be possible to find experts whose authority really is founded upon the authority of the thing itself, rather than in the power of suggestion or personal prestige. It would take an expert to decide who the experts are, and this leads into a vicious circle. The relation between administration and expert is not only a matter of necessity, but it is a virtue as well. It opens a perspective for the protection of cultural matters from the realm of control by the market, which today unhesitatingly mutilates culture. The spirit in its autonomous form is no less alienated from the manipulated and by now firmly fixed needs of consumers than it is from administration. The authoritarian establishment of the culture industry, independent of the latter allows it, through the co-optation of those to whom these matters are not alien to make certain corrections in the dictates of these needs. This would scarcely be possible if the sphere of culture were left totally at the mercy of the mechanics of supply and demand, to say nothing of the power of direct command by totalitarian rulers. The most questionable aspect of the administrated world, this very independence of the executive instances, conceals the potential of something better. The institutions are strengthened to such a degree that they, even if they in their function is transparent to themselves, are able to break through the principle of merely existing for something else, of adjustments to the deceptive wishes of a plebiscite. These wishes, were they to be fulfilled, would irrevocably repress everything cultural by bringing it forth from its presumed state of isolation. If the administrated world is to be understood as one from which all hiding places are fast disappearing, it should still be possible for this world to compensate for this and, by virtue of the powers of men of insight, to create centers of freedom as they are eradicated by the blind and unconscious process of mere social selection. That irrationality expressed in the independence of administration in its relation to society is the refuge of the inhibited development of culture itself. It is only through deviation from prevalent rationality that culture displays its ratio. Such hopes, however, are rooted in a state of consciousness on the part of administrators which is by no means simply to be taken for granted. It would depend upon their critical independence from the power and the spirit of a consumer society identical with the administrated world itself. All the suggestions heard thus far would amount to ideas with broken wings, were it not for a bit of false logic encountered in them. One adjusts all too readily to the prevailing conviction that the categories of culture and administration must simply be accepted as that into which they actually have developed to a large degree in historical terms, as static blocks which discreetly oppose each other as mere actualities. In so doing, one remains under the spell of that reification, the criticism of which is inherent in all the more cogent reflections upon culture and administration. No matter how reified both categories are in reality, neither is totally reified. Both refer back to living subjects, just as does the most adventurous cybernetic machine. Culture and administration 13. Therefore, the spontaneous consciousness, not yet totally in the grips of reification, is still in a position to alter the function of the institution, within which this consciousness expresses itself. For the present, within liberal democratic order, the individual still has sufficient freedom within the institution and with its help to make a modest contribution to its correction. Whoever makes critically and unflinchingly conscious use of the means of administration and its institutions is still in a position to realize something which would be different from merely administrated culture. The minimal differences from the ever constant which are open to him to find for him, no matter how hopelessly the difference concerning the totality. It is, however, in the difference itself in divergence that hope is concentrated. Note: 1 Wirtschaft und Gesellschaft, Tübingen, 1922. Page references in the text Q to this edition. 5. Freudian theory and the pattern of fascist propaganda. During the past decade, the nature and content of the speeches and pamphlets of American Fascist agitators have been subjected to intensive research by social scientists. Some of these studies, undertaken along the lines of content analysis, have finally led to a comprehensive presentation in the book, Prophets of Deceit, by L. Lowenthal and N. Guterman. The overall picture obtained is characterized by two main features. First, with the exception of some bizarre and completely negative recommendations, to put aliens into concentration camps or to expatriate Zionists, fascist propaganda material in this country is little concerned with concrete and tangible political issues. The overwhelming majority of all agitator statements are directed at hominem. They are obviously based on psychological calculations rather than on the intention to gain followers through the rational statement of rational aims. The term rabble-rouser, though objectionable because of its inherent contempt of the masses as such, is adequate insofar as it expresses the atmosphere of irrational emotional aggressiveness purposely promoted by our would-be Hitlers. If it is an impudence to call people rabble, it is precisely the aim of the agitator to transform the very same people, Freudian theory 133, into rabble, that is, crowds bent on violent action without any sensible political aim, and to create the atmosphere of the pogrom. The universal purpose of these agitators is to instigate methodically what, since Gustave Le Bon's famous book, Psychologie des Foules, is commonly known as the psychology of the masses. Second, the agitator's approach is truly systematical and follows a rigidly set pattern of clear-cut devices. This does not merely pertain to the ultimate unity of the political purpose, the abolition of democracy through mass support against the democratic principle, but even more so to the intrinsic nature of the content and presentation of propaganda itself. The similarity of the utterances of various agitators, from much publicized figures such as Coughlin and